Chapter 1676. Mu Nan was the most excited. He whispered proudly in the tribal group. Look, this is the swordsmanship of the Central Plains. How is it compared to your grassland swordsmanship? What do you mean by a long sword can't cut and can't fight? That's because you haven't seen a real master. How dare a frog at the bottom of a well spout nonsense? This was the first time Sher Bao was rendered speechless by such a pauper. But he could not refute anything. The sword was so fast that he could not see the person's movements or the movement of the arm. It was like two flashes of lightning, and everything was fine. Wuya could not bear to see her brother embarrassed and said, "His sword and yours are not the same thing, right?" Mu Nan boasted shamelessly, "Of course they are the same thing. It's just that he's faster, and I've only just started. One day, I'll reach his level. It's just a matter of time. The bandits won't wait for you." Wuya curled her lips. Lu Xiaoyi was not angry. He had experienced this kind of thing many times and could understand how the bandits felt now. But understanding was understanding, and taking action was taking action. These were two different things. His character and habit was to understand you until all 500 of you were dead. After 1,500 years of killing, what else could make him soft-hearted? He looked at the bandits and said, "I still suggest that you don't act rashly. Of course, you have the right to express your wishes, and I respect that. I'm the most reasonable person." This time, there were more than 10 riders charging at them. 7 or 8 of them charged forward to kill, while 5 or 6 of them shot arrows from the back. This was a test of Lu Xiaoyi's ability to adapt. He was not afraid of this kind of close combat, but he was not sure about the arrows because he was no longer a primordial spirit. Even if he could still judge, his body could not make the most sensitive reactions. Most of the time, he had no choice but to brandish his sword around himself to protect himself from the attacks of the arrows. This was not in line with his usual fighting habits. It was very low level, but in Mu Nan's eyes, it was like he had found a treasure. Look. Didn't you say that sword flowers are useless? They're just for show. When the scimitar strikes, everything will be over. Now you know the use of sword flowers? The swordsmanship of the Central Plains is extensive and profound. Every move and style has its own profound meaning. How can it be something that you can truly understand? Wuya's reaction was the fastest. She began to act coquettishly. "Brother Mu Nan, you promised me that you would teach me how to wield a sword." Mu Nan fell for this trick. "Teach? Of course he would. I, Mu Nan, have never been a selfish person. Swordsmanship can only flourish if it is carried forward." But he didn't even mention that his swordsmanship might not be the same as the Taoists. Of course, even he himself couldn't tell. Rather than calling what he had learned a sword technique, it was better to call it a sword dance. How could there be any real ability in it? On the open ground, Lu Xiaoyi was having a hard time killing. It wasn't that he couldn't do this now that he had lost his ability as a cultivator. Instead, he needed to thoroughly understand the limits of his current body so that he could allocate his abilities appropriately. Therefore, others might think that it was getting harder and harder for him to kill, but only he knew that it would only get easier and easier for him in the future. Killing a few mortals was nothing to be proud of, but he was also a mortal now, so there was no need to worry about karma. The heads of the families were in a bit of a dilemma. They were faced with a choice. Should they retreat under the guise of Miao Feng's evil power? Or should they rush forward and fight for the last time with the reputation of being a horse bandit? In this world without gods or monsters, martial strength was supreme. The so-called legends were somewhat illusory in people's eyes. They were far from the respect that was deeply rooted in people's hearts in the cultivation world. They didn't know that a person could kill an entire planet and wipe out an entire race. This was completely beyond their understanding. To them, they had seen too many brave people. In the end, they could all be solved by rushing forward. The only difference was how many people came. The horse bandits were shocked by this Taoist swordsmanship. However, no matter how shocked they were, it couldn't change their deep-rooted killing concept that had been ingrained in them for decades. Hundreds of horses charging forward, not to mention slashing, they would ram him to death. Lu Xiaoyi had already roughly grasped the limits of his body. For an experienced person like him, he only needed to kill a few people to know how far he could go. He was a little confused. There was no point in being a live target here. It couldn't prove anything. Fortunately, someone helped him to solve this problem. Before the horse bandits could organize to charge again, a few arrows flew out of nowhere. From the first leader to the fourth leader, none of them could escape. They all fell off their horses. This unforeseen event was much more serious than Lu Xiaoyi smashing the fifth young master to death, because it meant that there were 5 vacancies. Miao Foam Mountain was a mysterious legend. Countless leaders of the past generations had died here. Without a leader who could keep his word, the horse bandits immediately fell into chaos. Each group had their own ambitions, and no one was willing to submit to another. Even a real army could collapse after losing its commander. In this era of cold weapons, the dependence on the commander was more than anything else. Not to mention the horse bandits. The horse bandits hurriedly retreated. No one knew if they would come again. Lu Xiaoyi put away his sword and placed his hands behind his back. He began to size up Miao Foam Mountain, thinking about where to climb up. He was a little unaccustomed to not being able to fly. Others couldn't see where the arrows came from, but that didn't include him. With a direction in mind, he began to walk towards the entrance of the valley. There were still the knights of the Xiaoguan tribe waiting for him there. Excuse me. It's not good to block the main road like this. Are you going to collect tolls? The people of the Xiaoguan tribe recovered from their shock and finally understood a fact. They were saved. Although they didn't know the specific reason, was it because of this Taoist's unpredictable swordsmanship? Or was it because of those mysterious arrows? Or was it simply a manifestation of the magic of Miao Foam Mountain? None of these could change the fact that they were saved. Mu Nan was the first to welcome him, because he felt that he had the right to do so. As someone from the Central Plains, of course he had the obligation to be half a host. Taoist priest, you have great swordsmanship. Glory to the swordsman. I'm Mu Nan from Yanzhou Mountain Prefecture. Greetings, Taoist priest. Thank you for your help. Otherwise, I'm afraid we wouldn't have been able to get through this. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. He didn't know anything. He didn't care about Yanzhou or Mount Wei Prefecture. Now he only needed to find the person he was looking for and the temple he was looking for. No need to thank me. I'm also baffled. The last few arrows weren't my work. They were from someone else. I still have something to do, so I'll take my leave first. Mu Nan had the temperament of someone who is very familiar with him. He followed behind relentlessly. Taoist priest, may I know your name? I'm also a swordsman. I wonder if you can teach me a thing or two later, and express my gratitude? Lu Xiaoyi had already gone far away, and his voice gradually faded away. Taoist Lu from Feng Wei. The sword on his back is Chuanjin. With fate as the foundation, the real body is outside the real body. Chapter 1677. He climbed all the way up the mountain. How many years had it been since he climbed a mountain? The feeling of leaning forward and paying attention at all times? The mountain was not high, only a few hundred feet. He climbed very slowly because he was about to meet a group of swordsmen who did not seem to live in the same cultivation world as him. It was a very strange orthodoxy, but he had to admit that it was also a pure sword Tao. One could not treat other sword vain orthodoxies as heresy just because one was born in Xianyuan. At the top of the mountain, four Taoists were either sitting or standing. One was nibbling on a sweet potato, one was trimming his nails, one was reading a book, and one was in a daze. Seeing Lu Xiaoyi come up, the one who was nibbling on a sweet potato broke off a piece and handed it to him. Hungry? Lu Xiaoyi took it and nodded. Yes, how could I be restricted to being immortal? I get hungry very quickly. I've thought of countless ways to prepare, but I didn't expect that I would actually carry a bag of soy sauce meat and jump down. The Taoist laughed. You knew? If you knew, you would have carried too many things. So many that you would have fallen to your death. This poor Taoist is called Fu Gui. How should I address you? Lu Xiaoyi. The other three also introduced themselves. Fu Gui, Ju Chou. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. I'm still lacking a Fu Gui? The four of them looked over. Fu Gui said lightly, Daoist Lu, have you met my good-for-nothing junior brother? Lu Xiaoyi did not avoid it. It was a matter of time. Swordsmen's interactions were not so secretive. In the future battles, they would need a certain level of trust between them. I've met him. He's not very obedient outside. I gave him a beating. Fu Gui raised his eyebrows. You should have brought him back, Lu Xiaoyi refused. I don't have that obligation. His legs are on his body. The four of them were silent. After a long time, Fu Gui looked at him. Xian Yuan's. Lu Xiaoyi looked straight at him. Western Bright Sword Mansion? Both sides fell into silence. The Crow ancestor had introduced the Western Zhao Sword Mansion in his travel notes. Many of the so-called Taoist sword system came from the Western Zhao Sword Mansion. He held the sword vein in high esteem. As Lu Xiaoyi's cultivation level increased, his knowledge and experience also broadened. He had also studied the sword Dao steel for 100 years. Therefore, he knew that the sword vein was very impressive. Excluding the Crow ancestor, the general of Shizhao was actually a character on par with Emperor Xianyuan. They were all top-notch sword immortals who could ascend to immortality with their swords. It was obvious that their legacies were not inferior to Xuanyuan's. Crow ancestor had once entered the ruins of Shizhao and gained a lot. However, he lacked the most fundamental difference between Shizhao's inheritance and Xuanyuan's inheritance. This was the core of the Western Bright Sword Mansion. If this was the case, the glorious Light Emperor's defeat was understandable. They were both the most ferocious sword vein legacies in the universe. It was possible for one to win and the other to lose. In fact, the glorious Light Emperor had an advantage in mid-range and long-range combat. If he could expand this advantage in the future, it would not be much different from Fu Gui. The duel between swordsmen and Dharma veins was different. There would not be a situation where two people were evenly matched and then shook hands to make peace. Even if the gap between swordsmen was very small, life and death could be decided in an instant. This was the specialty of Sword Dao. It was full of uncertainty. But there was a difference. Xianyuan had more than 10,000 disciples. However, the Western Bright Sword Mansion only had 5 people. One of them had even run away. Why did they stay here? Were they burdened with something? Were they trying to atone for their sins? Or were they suppressed by some existence? The sword vein orthodoxy that was once so powerful and was on par with Xianyuan. What a pity! Only 5. Fu Gui was cold. Now it's 4. That's enough. Lu Xiaoyi was a little sad. The Crow ancestor did not mention much about this in his travels, but the general idea was there. In the face of pressure from the immortal court, the great Emperor Xianyuan chose to take a roundabout way, while the general chose to fight head-on. It was hard to say who was right and who was wrong, who was more pure. But from the results, the Shizhao legacy was struggling. Not to mention influencing the immortal court and the general trend of the universe, he did not even know when it would end. Not only was Xianyuan still alive, but he was also becoming more and more prosperous. When the Crow ancestor appeared, not only did he want to destroy the universe, but he also wanted to smash the pot of the immortal court and flip the table of the 4 great emperors. In the end, everyone had to start all over again. Only then would the world be turned upside down. In this sense, Xianyuan was far better than Shizhao. Rejecting the tragic hero complex was Xuanyuan's hidden attribute. To be honest, Lu Xiaoyi approved of it. Of course, Shizhao was also worthy of respect. I am under the order of the Heavenly Eyes to replace Shizhao and work together with everyone. I look forward to your advice. After the initial discomfort, Shizhao finally calmed down. Xianyuan, you are a good man. Your Crow ancestor is the role model of our generation of swordsmen. I heard that Xianyuan added a new Dao sword vein in the sword vein. If that's the case, we are actually one family. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. The sword vein of the universe should be one family. This was a very strange feeling, but Lu Xiaoyi could understand. What he was best at was understanding others, and then continuing to do things his own way after understanding them. As the sword vein that was as famous as Xianyuan in the past, one was in the sky, and the other was on the ground now. The feeling of disparity between them was unavoidable. If there were some narrow-minded people, they would even speculate that Shi Zhao's current decline was due to Xuanyuan's betrayal in the past. These were all understandable, but they could not be taken seriously, because the facts proved that Xianyuan could stand proudly in the world for so long, and Shi Zhao could not be compared to him in terms of behavior and means. Why did Shi Zhao have such an attitude towards Xianyuan after coming out? Why did the four Taoists here have such complicated feelings? In fact, it was all because of this. But Shi Zhao still came out in the end and decided to go to Xianyuan to have a look. The discomfort of the four Taoists here was only for a very short period of time. Everyone was selfish, but to be able to cultivate to such a level, one needed to be more broad-minded. Timu asked, "What a coincidence. Did Shi Zhao attack you?" Lu Xiaoyi smiled bitterly. If he had attacked me directly, it would have been better. At least, he could have controlled it. He attacked my senior brother, and it was very dangerous. It was almost unsalvageable. But fortunately, the end result was not bad. I think he wanted to go to Xianyuan to play. Timu said angrily, "You should have killed him. Or brought him to see me." Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. There are only a few hairy people like Shi Zhao, and Xuanyuan's strength is limited. It's better to use them sparingly. Although Lu Xiaoyi's words were very vague, the four of them were not. They knew what the so-called danger and unsalvageable were at their level. Shi Zhao was the most impulsive among the five of them. Otherwise, he would not have run out on his own. Fu Zhu took out a wrinkled piece of dried sweet potato. It was the last piece. He was a little reluctant, but he still handed it over. With our current state, the biggest pain is hunger. There are countless rules and regulations, and you will know them later. In tens of thousands of years, you are the first swordsman to be sent here. No matter what happened in the past, we should be brothers. Brother, welcome to Miao Feng Peak. Chapter 1678. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. The Heavenly Eye's description of the mission is unclear, so I don't really understand. What kind of danger, or rather, what kind of thing in this mortal world needs the protection of a few swordsmen? Speaking of which, how many years have you guys been guarding it? The five of them sat on top of Miao Feng and chatted. This was supposed to be a normal relationship between the two families. Starting from the great emperor and the general, the fates of the two families seemed to be separated, but in fact, they were closely linked. If the universe sword vein was seen as a whole, their result was very much in line with the long-term strategic arrangement. Give up one family and strengthen the other. Just for the sake of causing trouble. You can't be unscathed under the watchful eyes of the immortal court, so you must pay the price. It's either Shi Zhao or Xianyuan. Retreat in order to advance and counterattack. Now that the general trend had reached this point, they could already see something. Although the crow ancestor didn't say anything, and although everyone was confused, Lu Xiaoyi could see something because of his extremely restless personality. When a rice worm completely tore off his mask, a certain desire in his heart began to stir. The general trend of the universe was just an appetizer, and the change of the era was just a side result. The real goal was he couldn't tell others, because this was a tacit understanding between him and the crow ancestor. Only when a swordsman reached a certain height could he secretly realize something in the process of cultivation and the changes of the universe. He didn't know if there were other swordsmen who had this feeling, but he couldn't verify it and could only follow his heart, just like what he was doing now. Tens of thousands of years? I can't remember clearly. You only need to know that we were once the general's disciples. Because the general angered the immortal court, in order to leave a bloodline for us, he took the initiative to guard this place forever. Using this strange method to achieve another kind of eternity. Maybe you can see that we can't be considered as real humans. Are we sword spirits or humans? We're not too sure ourselves. We gave up our freedom, gave up the upper realm, and guarded here alone, just to wait. Fu Zhu let out a long breath. Our lineage is the essence of the general's sword lineage, and because of this, we can deeply integrate ourselves with the sword spirits. Otherwise, if he couldn't accept a disciple or pass down his legacy, what was the point of persevering? In the beginning, there were still some brothers and sisters who came here. But after tens of thousands of years and countless transformations, there were bound to be some brothers and sisters who couldn't make it through. Slowly, only the 5 of us were left. The reason why we ran out was because of the transformations in the new era. But don't worry, when his state of mind matures, no one will need to lock him up. He will come back to fulfill his responsibilities. Metamorphosis? Lu Xiaoyi didn't quite understand. Fu Qiu explained, our longevity comes from the deep fusion with the sword spirit. Although we can't reach the upper realm, every few thousand years, when there is a difference between the essence of us humans and the existence of the sword spirit, we need to merge once again. We call it metamorphosis. Through metamorphosis, we can summon new life, and another few thousand years will pass. This was a dangerous process, and no one could guarantee that they would succeed every time. Therefore, since tens of thousands of years ago, most of the Shi Zhao brothers had completely lost themselves in the process of metamorphosis. And for those who succeeded in metamorphosis, there will be a cognitive blind spot, which is Fu Qiu's state. He wasn't the first to run out, but he was the first to run into Xianyuan swordsman. Splendid World is too far away from the 5th ring, so far that before they reached their destination, they understood their responsibilities and had no choice but to come back. Lu Xiaoyi finally understood why Fu Qiu's swordsmanship was so fierce. Luminous Light's loss wasn't unjust. What kind of mission is this? Is it worth guarding here for tens of thousands of years? Fu Qiu's gaze became deep and serene. Everything in the world is about balance. Therefore, there are positive and negative, inside and outside, immortal and mortal. Among the wonders of the universe, there is the saying of the inner and outer scenic heavens. Have you heard of it? Lu Xiaoyi nodded. I've heard of it. The outer scenic heavens is the cage of the half-immortals in the weakened realm. The inner scenic heavens is the gathering place of the ancient corpse slayer Almighty. Originally, these things were the big secrets of cultivation in the human world. However, the collapse of the heavenly axiom is imminent. Now that news is everywhere, there's nothing to hide. Fu Qiu explained, what I want to say is, if there are immortals, then there are mortals. Immortals are superstructures built on the foundation of mortals. No high-level existence can break away from the support of mortals. This is not just talk. It's also not a big but empty ideology, but a real foundation of cultivation. For example, the inner scenic heavens and the outer scenic heavens both have half-immortal existences. Then, the existence of the inner and outer scenic heavens must also be balanced. How can it be balanced? It's not that the inner and outer scenic heavens are balanced. This is the view of the ignorant. They are all half-immortal realms, but the difference is caused by the different upper realm methods. They can't be balanced. If they want to be balanced, they can only be balanced through the mortal realm. Between the inner and outer scenic heavens, there exists such a mortal realm. It's huge and has deep fate. It can support the existence of the inner and outer scenic heavens. This place is the splendid world. This was the first time Lu Xiaoyi heard of this secret, but he couldn't be blamed. After all, these things were too far away from him. Fu Qiu continued, since it's a support, there must be some form of connection. With this kind of connection, half-immortals can't pass through, and of course, mortals can't pass through. But in the connection, under the accumulation of a long time, there will always be some bad things produced. Lu Xiaoyi was very curious. Is it the poison left behind by those half-immortals? Spiritual bodies? Resentment? Persistence? Fu Qiu shook his head. No. If it's really these things, how can we, who haven't become half-immortals, resist them? The spiritual bodies of those half-immortal cultivators have other places to go, but the place where they are connected is the poison left behind by the cultivation creatures that they created. Cultivation creatures? Fu Qiu smiled bitterly. Yes. For the vast majority of half-immortals, Once they died, their magical items, Taoist items, and living beings would have nowhere to go. Of course, most of them will disappear with the death of their master, but there will always be a small number of special existences that won't disappear because of the death of their master. Their realms are not recognized by the inner and outer scenic heavens after they lose their master. So they can't continue to exist in the inner and outer scenic heavens. As a cultivation creature, the one who created the inner and outer scenic heavens didn't give the inner and outer scenic heavens the ability to destroy them, and this is also inconsistent with the Great Tao. Releasing them outside the heavens, he was afraid that they would bring disaster to the human world, so he had no choice but to find a remote place to settle them down. It's at the place where it is connected to the splendid world. Originally, under the erosion of time, these existences could barely reach a balance with the number of newly deceased half-immortals. They could just live and die on their own at the junction. However, tens of thousands of years ago, because of the ancestor, yes, the general of the Western Zhao, who was capricious after drinking, the balance at the junction was broken. There was a possibility for these monsters to sneak into the splendid world. This is the real reason why we stayed here for tens of thousands of years. Chapter 1679. A drunken mistake? Are you kidding me? How could someone like the general get drunk? However, Lu Xiaoyi did not want to expose him. If he did, it would be awkward for everyone. Maybe it was because of some unknown motive, or maybe it was a backup plan to clean up the mess he caused. This seemingly normal act of atonement was actually to protect the inheritance of the Shi Zhao sword vein. Those who could become immortals were no fools, including the Shi Zhao general. Once things were clear, the general caused a disaster, and then he arranged for his Shi Zhao swordsmen to fill the hole. The other orthodoxies were not willing to come because there was no hope. In the end, the general used a small incident to atone for his sins, and left behind the inheritance after he caused a real disaster. How ingenious! What are these things? Lu Xiaoyi had a hunch, but he was not sure. Everything. There are insects, monsters, zombies, ghosts, and even mutated sword spirits. There are countless orthodoxies in the universe, and countless magical items and living creatures. There are only things you can't think of, but there is nothing you can't see. Fu Shi shook his head. But there's no need to worry. Since they've stepped onto the path of mortals that leads to the world of silk, they've naturally become mortals. Just like us, they don't have any of those bizarre abilities, and they only have some of the most basic instincts left. If we want to stop them and prevent them from entering the mortal world, we can only kill them at the connecting point. We can't let them in to kill us. This is the principle. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. He finally understood that there was no cultivation power at the connecting point between the immortal world and the mortal world. Everyone could only compete with ordinary strength. In all the orthodoxies, the only ones who could compete with these monsters with ordinary strength were the swordsman and the body cultivator. If a few Dharma cultivators were here, what could they do? If they could not cast spells, they were nothing. The general's backup plan was very clever. It was so clever that even if the immortal court knew that it was inappropriate to leave these Shi Zhao remnants alive, they could only grit their teeth and accept it. Otherwise, where would they find orthodoxies who were willing to use ordinary strength to guard the connecting point between the immortal world and the mortal world? There were also body cultivators who came to help guard this place. Lu Xiaoyi was curious. Fu Zhu nodded. That's right. This was because the foreign object at the point of connection was always changing, and its strength was uncertain. The choice was entirely dependent on the heavenly eyes. We can only say that we've tried our best, but there are times when we run out of strength. After all, without the power of a cultivator, there are times when we feel powerless. Am I the first and only swordsman to come here? Lu Xiaoyi asked. I can understand why the immortal court would rather send a body cultivator than a swordsman. They are afraid that we will collude with each other, especially your Xianyuan sword school. That's why I don't understand why you're here this time. Lu Xiaoyi could not say that this was most likely a punishment, but he still had not figured out where the punishment came from. Was it an open pit? Or was it a trap? Maybe it was just an accident. Who would be able to figure out the scheming of the higher-ups? So, the sword tomb mentioned by the back puppet is referring to Miao Feng Mountain? Fu Qiu nodded bitterly. That's right. Sword Mound is what we call it. We can't call it Western Bright Sword Mansion, right? That will hurt some people's nerves. Actually, it has nothing to do with your Xuanyuan Sword Mound small world. To us, there is no freedom, no hope, no future. There is only a dispensable immortality. Isn't that Sword Mound? I see that you guys are quite free. Don't you need people at the connecting point to the immortal and mortal worlds? Fu Qiu shook his head. No need. The sealing of the connecting passage has its own rules. When there are obstructions, they won't be able to pass through. We also don't need to guard inside. Only when the seal weakens during a certain period, like the beast tide, will we be busy. Usually, when we have more free time, we will come out to find some food. You don't know, even if our abilities are sealed, our appetite is far greater than ordinary people. Although we won't die if we don't eat, that damned feeling of hunger will always torture us. In this kind of mortal world, in this kind of remote place, where can we find enough food? Western Bright Sword Mansion's tradition is not to be afraid of violence, but we never bully the weak. So, after so many years, even dried sweet potatoes have become good stuff. Can you imagine a few high-level true monarchs, a swordsman who can dominate a region in the origin world, being reduced to such a state? Lu Xiaoyi felt a little sad. He could understand the distress of these brothers. They couldn't open their storage rings. Moreover, after tens of thousands of years, their storage rings probably didn't exist anymore, right? This kind of distress actually included him. Are there any taboos when interacting with these mortals? Fu Qiu laughed. What taboos?
We are mortals now.
We are no different from them. It's just that our martial strength is higher. This is a cultivation desert. If you can't fly, in the eyes of mortals, you will forever be made of flesh and blood. You can be unrestrained, but if you really attract the revenge of the army, it's actually a very troublesome matter for us. After so many years, everyone has long lost the thought of the mortal world. If you stay in a place for tens of thousands of years, so when we deal with trouble, we won't be as forceful as you. In order to minimize the disturbance, we can only spread some rumors in the surroundings. Then, when we meet the scene, we can verify it. For example, a few unlucky horse bandits? You can't accept disciples here? Even if you can't inherit the things of Western Bright Sword Mansion, at least you can change the environment you live in. You can't go as far as to eat dried sweet potatoes, right? Fu Qiu sneered. If we accept disciples, we will be harming them. Even if there is no spiritual opportunity here, it's impossible to cultivate. We have long lost such thoughts. Harming others is not beneficial to ourselves. There's no reason to add to the already unstable lives of these mortals. But you can, because you are a Xianyuan orthodoxy. As long as you can endure this thought. Lu Xiaoyi and the others had a long talk and finally had a rough understanding of the background of this mission. However, he still couldn't see where the trap was. Was it the danger of the connecting passageway? According to Fu Qiu and the others, the main reason why most of them didn't persist for tens of thousands of years was because of the fusion with the sword spirit once every few thousand years. There were very few who died in the connecting passageway and the battle with the strange creatures. This at least proved that the level of danger wasn't very high. Even someone with Fu Qiu's strength could persist for tens of thousands of years without dying. What kind of danger could he face? He still needed to further confirm it. I want to know, how did Fu Qiu escape? Is there such a loophole? You persevere here because of your beliefs. If one day you don't want to persevere, can you still leave here? Lu Xiaoyi actually wanted to know, if he needed, how could he leave here alone without the command of Heaven's Eye or the help of immortal Jin Xiao? Chapter 1680. In order to climb up the mountain, Mu Nan was exhausted. His companions who were descending the mountain were still somewhat reserved, or rather a little embarrassed. Strangers had saved you, yet they were obligated to teach you skills? The people of the grassland were more straightforward. According to their habits, They could not express their gratitude empty-handed. However, they had nothing now. They had thrown all their belongings down the mountain, or else they would not have lasted for so long. As for cows and sheep, there was not a single one who would lead a sheep when fleeing. Hence, they were a little embarrassed to go up and were thinking of how to get some gifts. The horse bandits were still wreaking havoc in the grassland. To them, who came and went like the wind and licked blood from their blades, it was normal to change a few leaders. They could not retreat just because of these setbacks. No matter who was gone, the winter of the grassland still had to pass. Hence, they could not leave Meowfing Mountain for the time being. They could only set up simple tents outside the mountain and wait for the report from the sentries. After much difficulty, they finally reached the peak. No one saw it except for the Taoist who had fallen from the sky, who was munching on dried sweet potatoes. His way of thinking was different from normal martial arts practitioners. He did not have so many rules and restrictions because he did not want to make a living out of it. He only wanted to learn 1 or 2 moves in the sword dance category for show. This was a common problem for scholars. They did not need to rely on martial arts to earn a living. Hence, they did not think that this was a presumptuous thing to do. Instead, they treated it as an elegant exchange between scholars and Taoists. Learn swordsmanship from me? Why do I have to teach you? You have to give a convincing reason, right? Lu Xiaoyi looked at the scholar in amusement. It was as if he was looking at his younger self. He did not care and only felt that with a book in hand, he had the drive to conquer the world. It was very childish, but it was also full of vitality. We can be friends. My surname is Mu, double Mu Qinglin. In Maowei Prefecture, and even in the Yanjiao Kingdom, I am still considered a little famous. In the future, Taoist Lu will travel to various countries and cities. It will be useful to say that I am a distinguished guest of the Mu family. He understood that the Mu family should be a local noble family with a long history. It had produced famous people and might have a certain influence on the court. It belonged to the noble family of the upper class, which was also a huge wealth. Only the children of such a powerful family would not care about coming here to find a sense of existence. Unfortunately, the horse gang did not know him. Lu Xiaoyi knew these young people very well. They had no bad intentions and were in the best period of their lives. What they saw and learned during this period would have a huge impact on their lives. However, he would not tolerate this fellow's temper as a disciple of a prestigious family. You want to learn something? There should at least be some presentable gift for becoming his disciple, right? You've come empty-handed. Haven't you heard the saying that the Tao should not be imparted lightly, and the Dharma should not be passed on carelessly? Moonin felt that this Taoist was a little vulgar and not elegant enough. He would vulgarize things that should not be brought to the surface. How could the Mu clan treat him unfairly when they befriended him? Not to mention the wealth. Just the title of being a distinguished guest of the Mu family was enough for him to enjoy endless benefits. With his temper, he did not want to befriend such a vulgar person. However, he wanted to show off in front of the people of the Xiaoguan tribe. It was not for the so-called grassland beauties. He was a child of a prominent family. What kind of beauties had he not seen in his life? He just wanted to vent his anger on Sherbao. A grassland barbarian dared to look down on scholars? He had to teach him a lesson about this bad habit of his. Therefore, he could only endure. You are right. Unfortunately, I am a fugitive and my hands are shy. Can you send it to me first, and we can talk about it later? With the reputation of the Mu family, I don't think we will really owe you anything. Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. You can take credit? How about this? I won't ask you to give me a gift now. Well, there are some things that you can help me with. Just take it as a test for you. Lu Xiaoyi's exhortation made Mu Nan very unhappy. However, he had to accept it since he had a request. When he climbed down again, for Shizhao Taoists appeared from the shadows and shook their heads. Junior brother, is this okay? Lu Xiaoyi widened his eyes. What's wrong with it? The emperor doesn't lack starving soldiers. You've made me look like a ghost. You've sealed everything except this sense of hunger. I can't be careless about my body's needs. You don't have to worry about it. It has nothing to do with you, Shizhao. It was my Xianyuan people who did it. I'm not afraid of offending those people. In this world, I can endure anything except hunger. This is my principle. This was not making a fuss over a minor issue. It was the after effect of having one's cultivation ability sealed. The cultivators who entered the splendid heaven and earth had all their abilities sealed, leaving behind a body that still had certain characteristics of a cultivator. This was something that could not be changed. Even if the body was not as tough as steel and was not impervious to fire and water, the vitality of the body cells was far beyond that of an ordinary person. In the world of cultivation, these consumptions were all replenished through spiritual opportunity. Whether it was the purple purity, jade purity, or even the lowest level of spiritual opportunity in the realm, they could always provide the cultivator with all the elements that the body needed. In fact, to a cultivator, this was a negligible expenditure and did not affect anything. However, in this pure mortal world, one's abilities were completely sealed. They could not use the power of cultivation to replenish themselves. These consumptions that once seemed negligible now showed themselves. There was no other way to replenish themselves except for the most basic food. He was very hungry because his body needed it. Fuyu explained, "Actually, junior brother, you don't have to be too worried. When your body's needs reach a certain level, your sealed cultivation will always transfer a trace of energy to help you. You won't starve to death. So, if you're used to hunger, all of this actually doesn't matter. Why do I have to be used to hunger?" Lu Xiaoyi frowned. "They sent me to do things and didn't even give me enough to eat. Can't I think of my own way? I won't be afraid of this lawsuit no matter where it goes. What difference between immortals and mortals? I can't preach. If they have the ability, let them do it themselves. I'll also starve for a few days. Let's see who still won't talk about this nonsense." The position of one's buttocks was different. The way of dealing with the problem was naturally different. The Western Bright Sword residence was suppressed too ruthlessly. They did not dare to cross the line. However, in Lu Xiaoyi's view, these were a few fellows who were ruthless to themselves and had enough forbearance. He did not know what the general had said to them, but all they were doing now was to make up for it and wait. They were not willing to destroy their tens of thousands of years of persistence because of some insignificant reasons. They were not willing to expose themselves before the opportunity arrived. This was their way. Lu Xiaoyi's way was different. He wanted to use this method to express his dissatisfaction, to seek conflict and change. Only by causing trouble could he see the truth behind it. It could not always be like this. Chapter 1681. To Lu Xiaoyi, now that he could not cultivate, he did not seem to have anything important to do. It was really difficult for him to spend his days in a barren place like Miaofeng Mountain. Fu Zhu led him, giving him a rough idea of where they would be fighting in the future. The entire Miaofeng Mountain was actually a ring-shaped mountain, standing tall on the grassland. There was no such thing as a mountain range. It was as if it was pulled out of thin air. Within the ring-shaped mountain, there was a small valley where there were people farming. The passageway was not within the valley, but outside the valley, on top of a cliff. The terrain here was steep, it was impossible to climb, the stone walls were smooth, and there were no vines growing here. Very few people had the intention to come here. The two of them came to the top of the cliff, a height of 1,000 feet. To them, it was just as dangerous. Fu Zhu pointed at the bottom of the cliff and smiled. "Do you feel anything?" Of course, he felt it. After cultivating for 1,000 to 2,000 years, even if one's cultivation base was sealed, one's senses and sensitivity towards Tao could not be sealed. This was also the reason why everyone here was a monarch. Only they could still hide this consciousness in the depths of their bodies and have enough mortal strength to deal with the invasion of the foreign species. Without replying, he leaped forward. If Mu Nan and the others saw this, they would definitely think that this Taoist was trying to commit suicide. However, Fu Ji did not think so. He followed closely behind and leaped forward. Then, the two of them mysteriously disappeared under the stone cliff. It was as if there had never been such two reckless Taoists. Lu Xiaoyi stepped on the solid ground and said in surprise, "There's really a path." Fu Zhu sighed, "We can't even fly, and there's no ground to support us. What can we do? This path is a few feet narrow and 100 feet wide. With our manpower, we can only guard the narrowest part. We still need to go forward. The two of them walked forward. Lu Xiaoyi scooped up a handful of soil, sniffed it carefully, and tasted it with his tongue. There's no spiritual energy at all. It's absolutely transparent. Fu Zhu shook his head helplessly. This passageway, there are actually some problems with its construction. I don't know what Mao Hong was thinking, to leave such a loophole here. He explained to Lu Xiaoyi, the passageway is very long, about several thousand li long. This is not a problem for cultivators, but for us, it is a problem. In the long tunnel, there are a few wide areas where the abominations reside. They also kill each other, following their instincts. When the tunnel is no longer obstructed, they will rush over here. Have you explored the entire passageway? Has it been completely wiped out? Fu Qiu sighed. Tens of thousands of years ago, when there were still many senior and junior brothers, we did a few cleansing of the entire passageway. There's a problem here. It's not easy to clear the wide area because we don't have a flying sword. We still have to arrange people to intercept them, so we can encircle and annihilate them here. They took advantage of the chaos and ran to Jinxiu. Later on, as the number of senior and junior brothers decreased, they no longer had the strength to do so. The time window is also a problem. There have been cases where the people in charge of clearing out the enemies were trapped in a certain area and couldn't return for a period of time. The two of them hurried forward. There was no scenery along the way, and there were no signs of life. Blocking the other end? Is that even possible? Fu Qiu shook his head. The burden is too great. Moreover, you know very well that these things are pervasive. No matter how tightly you block them, they will always find a way to infiltrate. In the end, it still depends on us to clean them up. Lu Xiaoyi was just saying. In this cultivation world, you can't use engineering methods to solve problems. The block he was talking about was not to build a fence, but to use a more cultivation method. However, on this ordinary road, it was destined to not work. The two of them ran for 100 li and used 2 hours. Fu Qiu was somewhat impressed. In fact, without the nourishment of magic power, the physical strength of most cultivators was very weak. When everything was sealed, and only the physical strength was left, it was clear who was training and who was slacking off. Even for body cultivators, after tens of thousands of years, there was no one who could keep up with him in running 100 li. This was because the direction of body cultivators was somewhat different. This swordsman ran with him for 100 li and didn't fall behind. He also didn't have a red face and was out of breath. It seemed simple, but it was actually not easy. This meant that this person had never stopped the most basic physical training for more than 1,000 years. This kind of training was a common occurrence for people of the Western Zhao, but it was especially precious for true monarchs with cultivation in the outside world. The Xianyuan sword faction was now able to lead the sleeve sword vein in the origin world. Just by looking at this self-discipline, one could see a little bit of it. It was not unjust for Fu Qiu to be defeated by such a person. There was no way to continue forward because the road ahead was blocked. Our current method is that when there are signs of the passage loosening, it will be very clear on the cliff. Then we will enter here and push forward until the nearest narrow path is blocked again. Even if we complete a task of blocking once. This is a beautiful world, a pure land of mortals. It is mutually reinforcing and restraining with the inside and outside of Jingtian. There are no spells, so even immortals can't set up traps here. They can only use people to block it. So this place has always been blocked. Fu Qiu nodded, that's right. But I don't know why the general made it half-blocked. This is a very strange matter. Lu Xiaoyi said, it's better to let it go than to block it. If it's completely blocked, these things have no other way to go to other places, right? I don't think so. He thought of the zombies in the king zombie world and the crawling insects in the big fruit platter world. If the swordsmen of the Western Zhao hadn't cleared the passage for a long time, it was completely possible that some accident happened. Of course, this couldn't be blamed on them. There were only 5 people, and all of them had their abilities sealed. They didn't have the strength to completely clear the passage. There were many things in this world of cultivation that appeared inexplicably. Finding the reason was also inexplicable. It was just a hunch, and he didn't have any real evidence. Fu Qiu sighed. Let it go. Everyone knows the reason. But where can we let it go? We can't do anything in the inside and outside of Jingtian. They are all places where half-immortals are active. We, as Supremes, can't do anything. Mortal world? Then there's no need to think about it. It's the only place we can protect. These things should be taken care of by the immortal court, but in the end, it's on our heads. But for the Western Zhao inheritance, this seems to be a chance to struggle at death's door? It's just that after such a long time, what's the meaning of the so-called immortality to us? Lu Xiaoyi said, living has its own meaning. From the records of my sect, the general of your family is not a person who lives a miserable life. So, I think that since he arranged for you to wait here, there must be a reason for his arrangement. If you can't guess it, then live on. Chapter 1682. Since I've been here, I've never heard you talk about the fighting ability of those strange creatures. Is it unbearable? Or is there some other reason? Fu Qiu said, there's nothing much to say about the fighting itself. You know, if those strange creatures have their cultivation power sealed, with their intelligence and experience, they're nothing in front of humans. The reason Heaven's Eye sent you here isn't because we can't defeat them, but because we have too few people. It's inevitable that some of us will be missed when the beasts rush at us. We can't fly, and we can only hold our swords in our hands. If one of them runs over, what else can we do other than chase after him? That's why we sent you here. Just in case. Well, in terms of numbers, the strange creatures passing through the passage have actually been decreasing these years. I don't know why, but is it because of the collapse of the Great Way that these things have decreased? Maybe they've been diverted? Who knows? Lu Xiaoyi returned to Miaofeng Mountain. He was different from Daoist Shizhao's traditional low-key forbearance. Lu Xiaoyi showed his ability without any scruples. It was not the power of a cultivator. It was something he had wielded for thousands of years. What was there to hide? After the people in the lower pass found out about the whereabouts of the horse bandits, he began to attack the horse bandits who were herding the sheep and cattle. He had no choice but to lead the people in the lower pass, because he could deal with the horse bandits, but not these animals. The ability of herding was not something he could master. The horse bandits certainly didn't want to lose their winter supplies just like that. They forced Lu Xiaoyi to change a group of leaders and left some harsh words. If you're not convinced, then come. Sooner or later, I'll give each of you a chance to be a leader. The cattle and sheep that were pulled back were divided into 5 groups. Half of them returned to the people in the lower pass, and the other half became teachers. In fact, they were encircled somewhere in the valley, roasting a few every day to satisfy their cravings. This scene made the people in the lower pass secretly frightened. The 5 Taoists were like 5 bottomless pits. Each meal had 10 sheep, and each person ate 2. This was only half full because they weren't presumptuous. Swordsmanship was also taught, but it was all basic stuff. It was completely Lu Xiaoyi style. He never hid anything when he taught people, but he was also too lazy to explain anything. As long as you were willing to put in the effort to learn, you would definitely achieve something. But if you were to slack off for 3 days and dry the net for 2 days, that was up to you. To a true monarch like him, the meridians and acupoints of martial arts were as simple as they could be. They could be applied with just a bit of organization. This was the specialty of cultivators. Everything was for the sake of filling one's stomach. Mu Nan began to slack off after only a few days of learning. He preferred to listen to Lu Xiaoyi talk about Taoist stories and philosophies. This was what he was good at. The ones who were willing to work hard to practice swordsmanship were Shi Bao and a few other tribesmen from the Lower Guan tribe. In the process of following the Taoist to snatch the flock of sheep, they had truly seen what it meant to have a horse like a dragon, a sword like the wind, 10 charges, 10 victories, and no one was a match. Taking advantage of the fact that they had worked together several times, they became familiar with each other and became the Taoist's disciples. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi did not perform the etiquette of a master and disciple. To him, this was just a process of swindling food and drink. A few months later, a few Taoists dashed towards the cliff and jumped off it one after another. In the passage, the 5 of them ran wildly. They needed to rush forward as fast as possible and seize the narrow position as soon as possible. Since they were already mortals, they needed to change the way they fought. They could not have the mentality that if one person defended, 10,000 people would not be able to get through. After running for a few miles, 2 huge reptiles appeared in front of them. They had forelimbs like door planks, huge mouthparts, and thick hind legs. They seemed to be of the same species. Fu Ji slowed down and shouted, "Junior brother Lu." Lu Xiaoyi knew what he meant. He wanted him to deal with them alone and familiarize himself with the general combat level of the strange creatures here. The 4 of them had been guarding this place for tens of thousands of years, but this was his first time. Only by familiarizing himself with them in advance could he have a sense of propriety when the strange creatures appeared in large numbers. He was actually no stranger to these reptiles. He knew where their weaknesses were. Without supernatural powers, such a huge body was just a target for him. Lu Xiaoyi did not change his speed. As he rapidly approached the 2 large reptiles, he suddenly accelerated when he was 3 feet away from them. The sharp change in speed allowed him to narrowly pass between the 2 large reptiles. At the same time, 2 streaks of sword light flashed, and the 2 reptiles' heads fell to the ground. His movements did not stop. When he passed by the reptile's body, he leaped out and dodged the reptile's desperate stinger before it died. He had seen these movements countless times on the big fruit plate nut star. It was the natural instinct of most of the reptiles. He could not think that it was over after the heads fell off. He still had to guard against the inertia of their bodies. The few Shizhao Taoists secretly nodded. He was indeed worthy of being the top sword vein that was as famous as the Shizhao Taoists. Although he mainly focused on mid-range and long-range attacks, they could not find any fault with his close combat skills. Whether it was the control of distance, the grasp of timing, or the sharpness of the sword, they could do nothing more than this. Fu Gui caught up with him and ran side by side. Good swordsmanship. In the passage, most of the strange creatures are basically at this level. Because we don't have to worry about their various strange supernatural powers, the battle is usually more simple. With Junior Brother's ability, nothing here is a threat to you. But there's one thing that Junior Brother should pay attention to. Don't use too much strength, and preserve your physical strength. You actually used too much strength just now. You can still reduce it a little. Maybe you still think of them as true cultivators and are afraid that you can't break their defense? Don't forget that we are now mortals and have no spiritual opportunity to replenish ourselves. Moving your muscles for a long time will still make you tired and sore. Lu Xiaoyi humbly listened to the advice. He looked at Ru Gui and Ti Gui, who were behind him carrying 2 front limbs of the door that they had just removed. What are you doing? Using this to chop the enemy? Fu Shi sighed. This is what you must learn, Junior Brother. Among all the insects and beasts, what can be eaten? What can't be eaten? What's delicious? What's not delicious? These are all necessary skills to guard this place. You have to know that we can stay in the passage for at least a year, and at most 10 years. We can't work on an empty stomach. Junior Brother, you don't have any psychological barriers to this, do you? Lu Xiaoyi immediately understood what was going on. No problem. If senior brothers can eat, then I can eat too. I'll just treat it as eating spirit beast meat. He understood a little. In this place, the trouble was not the battle itself, but the physical limitations of mortals like them. There were many problems that cultivators did not need to consider at all, but now they had become crucial problems. Who would have thought that for a cultivator, eating could be a problem? But now that they did not have those true cultivators' methods and could not open their storage rings, this was a very realistic matter. Chapter 1683. There were a few more foreign creatures in front of them, and Lu Xiaoyi was still in charge of dealing with them. During this process, not only did he need to learn how to control his physical strength, but he also needed to learn how to identify things that could replenish his nutrients. There were also monsters, puppets, spiritual bodies, zombies, zerg, and all kinds of strange things. However, there was one thing that was common. Zerg were the most common, followed by zombies, because they could reproduce. There weren't many half-immortal realm cultivators who raised insects. However, even though there weren't many of them, they could peacefully breed in places like the connecting passageway. Comparatively speaking, puppets, spirit bodies, and treasures were rare. Every time one of them died, there would be one less of them. Lu Xiaoyi could understand why there were so many insects, but he did not understand why there were so many zombies as well. Could these things reproduce? Negative Centipede also did not understand this question. He only had a rough idea. There are many kinds of zombies, but I have never heard of any that could reproduce. However, there is one situation that you may have overlooked. Some people raise zombies in a space similar to an ancient battlefield. If such a space also enters the connecting passage, there will be an endless stream of zombies. This is because the old zombies in charge do not have the self-discipline of human cultivators. They will not consider the impact if there are too many zombies, nor will they pursue quality. They only know that the more, the better. However, we have never found such a space before. There was none in the past, and now that we have fewer people, of course, it is even more impossible. The 5 of them ran all the way. There were more and more foreign creatures in front of them, and they could no longer maintain their initial speed. One difficulty was that in the normal width of the passage, which was hundreds of feet wide, it was difficult for the 5 of them to completely block it. Therefore, they had to be careful. They first sent 2 or 3 people to sweep the front, and then left 2 people behind to hunt down the fish that escaped the net. This was a delicate job. If they missed one, it would cause harm to the splendid world, and that would be a dereliction of duty. The only good news was that although it was also called a tide, these waves of foreign creatures were at most 30 to 40 at a time. They could barely hold on. This was the reason why they had to rush forward as soon as possible. It was because they had to race against time and occupy the narrowest passage before the waves of foreign creatures really formed. At this critical moment, the ones who rushed forward to sweep were 3 veterans, Negative Centipede, Entering Nightmare, and Lifting Centipede. Lu Xiaoyi and another Taoist were at the back to pick up the leftovers. He had nothing to be dissatisfied about. He wasn't narrow-minded enough to complain that he wasn't given an important task. As soon as the Shizhao swordsmen made a move, he could see their unparalleled ability in close combat. They were indeed the disciples of General Shizhao. When it came to close combat, other than the 7 ants in his hand, which had a great advantage, he was no match for them in close combat. My back is not spouting nonsense. He wasn't a sore loser. After all, close combat wasn't everything. These old men were now half-human and half-sword spirits. They had been eating close combat sword skills for tens of thousands of years. They were not as embarrassing as them. In fact, it was no different from the close-range sword techniques Lu Xiaoyi was familiar with. It was concise, ruthless, decisive, insightful, and not sloppy at all. It was as if one was dancing on the tip of the knife of death, but could always escape unscathed. This was the pinnacle of swordsmanship, and it made him gasp in amazement. After cultivating the sword Dao for 2,000 years, he had finally met someone who was at the same level as him in a certain aspect, and perhaps even slightly better than him. This made him feel that this trip had not been in vain. For a true master of swordsmanship, killing was like an art. It was pleasing to the eye. The 5 artists cooperated with each other in such a forward attack, one after another. In addition to the sword light, there were also loud shouts. It was like a fight in the mortal world. This kind of feeling was very novel, and also very warm. After all, it had been a long time since he was so happy and simply immersed in a simple slaughter. There are 3 puppets 100 feet to the left. I might miss one.
Xiao-Yi, catch it.
There's a pile on the right.
Slow down.
Enter Nightmare and come over to help. Xiao-Yi, the 2 hind legs of that grasshopper are delicious. Don't forget to cut them off. And the tongue. It's delicious when roasted with wine. Xiao-Yi, don't touch that sarcoma. It's full of pus. Unsurprisingly, The 5 of them rushed along the way and found a narrow opening that was only a few feet wide, 200 miles away. This was their fixed defensive position. There are a few more such narrow openings in front, but we can't rush forward. It's meaningless, because we can't clear out the strange creatures in front of us. In the end, we have too few people.
There's nothing we can do about it.
What do you mean there's nothing we can do? Is it difficult to transfer 100 Supremes to the cultivation world of the main world? You can push all the way and clear them once and stop for 1,000 years. It's just that someone doesn't want you Shizhao to be idle. His words were a bit heavy because there was still no end to this oppression. No one knew where the dawn was, and there were only 5 people left in Shizhao. There was even one who ran away. You said there's a sword spirit here. Why don't I see it?
Fu Zhu sighed.
Do you really want to see it? Every sword spirit here is a half-immortal ancestor of our sword vein. There's definitely no one in Shizhao, but it's possible that there's one in Xianyuan. We've seen a sword spirit once. Its orthodoxy is unknown. It was when we first came here tens of thousands of years ago. It's not one of our orthodoxies. It's a very lonely existence. We can't bear to touch it, and it didn't attack us. Later, it disappeared. I don't know if it's still here after so many years. I heard that not every sword spirit would come here. Some disappeared with their masters, some disappeared without a trace, and some were subservient to the heavenly Tao. But what kind of sword spirit would come here? There might be some accidental factors in it, right? This topic was even heavier. They wanted to see a sword spirit, but they also didn't want to see one. It was a very complicated feeling. The gathering of different kinds began to pressure them. Fortunately, there were too many kinds. Like their original masters, no one was willing to submit to anyone, so they couldn't organize themselves. This was the main reason why the 5 of them could deal with it easily. During this process, Lu Xiaoyi began to systematically come into contact with the various ownerless magical objects left behind by the half-immortal ancestors after their deaths. He didn't know why there were no half-immortals in the inner and outer scenic skies to take them in. Were they unwilling? Or did they not have a chance? In theory, when one reached the level of half-immortal, it was impossible for them to take a fancy to other people's magical objects. They preferred to condense their own magical objects, which were more suitable to them. Moreover, they didn't have to worry about any problems in using them. There were too many secrets in the cultivation world. There were so many that you could never understand them all. You could only take one step at a time. If you encountered some tricky ones, you wouldn't dare to look at them. However, Lu Xiaoyi's thoughts were always jumping around. What's the other end of the inner and outer scenic skies like? In theory, if these things can go to Jinxiu from this passage, then it seems that we can also go to the inner and outer scenic skies from here? Chapter 1684. Just as Fu Shi had said, Lu Xiaoyi did not encounter anything too troublesome when he was intercepting the divergent beasts. When all the cultivators were sealed together, what kind of difference would there be between them? Simply speaking, humans were the weakest when it came to their physical bodies. This was without a doubt. However, to the cultivators at the level of true monarchs, they had at least gone through thousands of years of bitter cultivation. This was especially true for sword cultivators and body cultivators. The difference between their physical bodies and other cultivators was not that obvious. Even if they were sealed, it was impossible for them to completely enter the state of a mortal in the initial stage of Tao initiation. The seal was not a reversal. 4 physique cultivators and swordsman physique cultivators who paid more attention to their physique, their sealed bodies were enough to withstand the divergent beasts. This was because the divergent beasts did not actively train their bodies. They did not know how to do push-ups, run daily, and lift stone weights, but humans did. After thousands of years of perseverance, the difference was not that big. But on the other hand, the difference between them was huge. Intelligence, experience, vision, knowledge, judgment, and so on. Humans were still at the level of supremes in these aspects, but these cultivators relied on their masters to survive. Once their masters died, it was easy to imagine their own survival and fighting ability. They were not on the same level. It was not the fun of fighting, but it was the thrill of fighting. Lu Xiaoyi and the four Daoist Shi Zhao had stayed in this narrow passage for a full year. During this period, the divergent beasts had never exceeded the scale of 100 divergent beasts at a time. Most of the time, the divergent beasts were also poking their heads out and looking around, hesitating. They had basic intelligence and they knew about danger. They knew that they had to make a choice between freedom and life. Lu Xiaoyi had the opportunity to taste various kinds of insect beast meat. The taste was not very good because they rarely had the chance to use fire, so they had to eat it raw. Of course, they had a fire starter, but they did not have any fuel. Eating raw meat and drinking blood was an unthinkable thing for cultivators, but it happened to the universe's top supremes and swordsmen. Everyone took it with equanimity. This included Lu Xiaoyi. If others could eat it, he could eat it too. In many aspects, he did not have any so-called taboos. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Slowly, Lu Xiaoyi's friendship with the old Shi Zhao bastards deepened. From fellow apprentices, they became brothers. They learned about the recent general trend of the universe from Lu Xiaoyi, and Lu Xiaoyi also learned more about the secrets of Shi Zhao from them. Among the remaining 5 people, Fu Qiu and Ti Xiu were at the Yang spirit realm, while the other 3 had 2 primordial spirits and 1 yin spirit. It had been like this since tens of thousands of years ago. If they could still live for tens of thousands of years, their cultivation would still be at this level. This was because they could no longer be considered as real humans. Through the fusion with the sword spirit, they achieved incomplete immortality. At the same time, they also lost the privilege of humans to reach a higher level. The people of Shi Zhao rarely mentioned the past, as they did not want to confuse Lu Xiaoyi. Moreover, they did not know much at that time. This was the general's protection for them. If they were not in that position, they should not know the things that only those in that position should know. Their discussion was more about swordsmanship, not specific swordsmanship methods. It was more about a concept. The close-range swordsmanship of Shi Zhao has gone a little astray when it comes to us. Because of the fusion with the sword spirit, we can achieve many changes that other sword vein can't. However, compared to normal situations, it's hard to say whether it's a benefit or a disadvantage. In our opinion, although this fusion method can improve our close-range skills, it's not necessarily a good thing for the cultivators themselves. Losing the path to the upper realm and living like this, we lose the meaning of being a swordsman. It was very melancholy because some choices were not up to them. If they did not do this, they would not even be left in Shi Zhao Sword Mansion. When Su On Yuan added the Dao sword vein, we were very pleased and felt that the burden on our shoulders was lighter. The Crow ancestor was the greatest figure in the history of the sword vein. In a sense, he was above the great emperor and the general. Unfortunately, although we lived in the same era, we did not have the chance to meet him. The Crow ancestor inherited the part of the mainstream sword vein of Shi Zhao's swordsmanship. Therefore, we were thinking whether we could also make a summary of the core part of Shi Zhao's swordsmanship. After all, we have to organize our own things. For tens of thousands of years, many of our senior and junior brothers have done their best. It can be said that even if we did not integrate with the sword spirit, we are confident that we can train our successors to reach a certain height in swordsmanship. This is the result of our personal experience for tens of thousands of years. Unfortunately, these things are engraved on the stone slab on the mountainside, and no one is willing to take a look at them. This is also fate. Lu Xiaoyi could understand what he meant. Shi Zhao could not rise for the time being. Since the Crow ancestor was able to collect most of Shi Zhao's swordsmanship, he could certainly collect the core swordsmanship of Shi Zhao and pass it on to him. Although Shi Zhao's future prospects were foggy and he was more likely to fail than prosper, as long as he was open-minded and passed on the real thing, it did not matter whether there was still Shi Zhao or not. This was the accomplishment of reaching a certain level. It was also an acknowledgement of Su On Yuan. The reason why he did not say it directly was that he was afraid of being rejected and losing face. Secondly, he was afraid that it would cause both sides to be involved in karma. Therefore, the stone slab was just there. No one in Jinxiu world could understand it. If Lu Xiaoyi was willing to learn, he could go back and find time.
No one would care about him.
Lu Xiaoyi understood very well. Of course, he would not express anything explicitly. This was a tacit understanding. Senior brother is right. Cultivators of our generation pursue immortality, but it must be immortality that we can make our own decisions about. A swordsman is a swordsman, and a sword is a sword. It does not mean that the ultimate goal of becoming a swordsman is to become a sword. We are humans. Only by persevering on this point can we have unlimited possibilities, and not some magical item that seems to give us immortality. This was a journey of sashimi. For a whole year, Lu Xiaoyi and senior brother Shi Zhao ate sashimi for a whole year. There was no mustard, only salt. There were no accidents, just like every time the people of Shi Zhao experienced it. In the past few hundred years, it feels like there are fewer foreign species than usual. I wonder if there are any changes in the inner and outer scenic sky. Under the influence of a mysterious force, there were abnormalities in the passage. Retreat. Carrying the order, the 5 of them began to run back. They had to be fast. Otherwise, it would be troublesome if they were blocked in the passage. Although they would not starve to death, staying in such a place for a few years was torturous. It was a test of their mental fortitude. This time, although they were sealed as mortals, it was not a difficult task. Chapter 1685. More than a year had passed, and the people who went down the mountain had already returned to their homes. Although they were the village that suffered the most damage, they had left a good reputation for fighting against the bandits. It would take many years for them to recover, but to the people who went down the mountain, the biggest reward was that they had found a true backer. The name of Miaofeng Mountain was once again spread, but this time there was real evidence, because many people had seen a ruthless Taoist who specialized in killing the head of the family. The point was, you couldn't hide from him. Shi Bao and the others left, but even more people heard the news and came looking for them. They all wanted to verify something, but they could not see anyone. Just like every time in history, they would show their heads and reveal their traces, and then they would disappear without a trace. There was one person who didn't leave, and that was Mu Nan. As a traveling scholar, he had all the characteristics of a prominent family. He was curious, had no pressure to survive, liked new things, and was passionate about finding out the truth. Therefore, he who had nothing to do had the most time. He wanted to find out if the name of Miaofeng Mountain had anything to do with these Taoists. Judging from the current situation, it was inevitable that there was a connection. But how did they manage to maintain such an influence for thousands of years? Everyone had to die, at most 100 years, so it needed to be passed down from generation to generation. In order to not lose the legacy, it needed a certain number of disciples to ensure that the legacy would not be cut off. However, he didn't see this in Miaofeng Mountain. There were only a few Taoists with amazing appetites, and there were no more than 5 of them. How did they pass down the legacy? Among the few Taoists in Miaofeng Mountain, there was only one who was easy to get in touch with, and that was the one who fell from the sky. The rest of them were elusive, and they were rarely seen. The name of Taoism? Well, actually, the name is not important, but the concept is important. If you want to talk about the name, there is one, and it can be called Quanzhen. Lu Xiaoyi and his group had just exited the connecting passage when Mu Nan stopped him and asked him questions about Taoism. Of course, there was Taoism in splendid heaven and earth, but because there was no cultivation and the world was closed off from the outside world, it was very limited in terms of learning. Once Mu Nan came into contact with Lu Xiaoyi's many views on Taoism, he felt that it was a completely new world. For a descendant of a prominent clan like him, the education he received from a young age was extremely broad, which inevitably included the Taoism of the 100 schools of thought. Only when he grew older and experienced more would he be able to determine his own direction. This was the reason why he was so interested in Lu Xiaoyi's theory. He was at the stage where it was easiest for him to accept new things. Quanzhen sect? Quanzhen sect? It sounds very powerful. Master, Lu Xiaoyi interrupted him. I'm not your master. Don't shout. If you're willing to learn something, I can teach you when I'm free. However, the relationship between master and disciple cannot be mentioned lightly. It's too heavy. You, on the other hand, refuse to learn proper sword techniques and are instead obsessed with these theoretical things. Munan laughed. He was the descendant of a prominent clan and naturally had a sense of superiority. Therefore, when he spoke, he did not put himself in a lower position and was very casual. You don't want to be involved in this, but I don't want to either. Sword techniques are only a match for 1 or 10 people, but knowledge is a match for 10,000 people. I don't need to rely on swordsmanship for my future, because there are many people in the Mu clan who understand swordsmanship. Although they are not as good as you, there are still a lot of them. I'm afraid that if I learn the true essence of your swordsmanship, I will be involved in your Jianghu disputes. Wouldn't that be a loss for the greater good and neglect the essentials? Lu Xiaoyi fell into deep thought. At night, Ming Yao was alone on the peak of the mountain. Mu Nan's words during the day had touched him. He had never believed that the Heavenly Eye's mission this time was simple. This was his intuition. However, he could not find the source of this intuition, no matter how hard he tried. It was only after Mu Nan's irresponsible nonsense that he suddenly realized that this could be a trap. Yes, it was the inheritance. If he looked at the stone slab, if he inherited Shi Zhao's sword vein, would he inherit part of Shi Zhao's karma? He was not afraid of anything. Now, he had some understanding of the chess game that the great emperor and the General Crow ancestor had set up. The more it was like this, the more he understood that he should not be involved in it easily before he fully matured. Patience, this was the real rhythm of intervention. Not dying before the start of the battle. Among the 3 ancestors of the sword vein, the general met with misfortune after becoming an immortal. The great emperor also disappeared after becoming an immortal. The crow ancestor was the most powerful, but he still used his life in exchange for the descent of morality not long after becoming an immortal, which led to the collapse of the great Tao. They all started after becoming immortals, but the results were different. It was hard to say whether they achieved their goals or not. However, to him, becoming an immortal was the real threshold, the day he revealed his true intentions. Before that, he had to act like his ancestors and disguise himself as a harmless person. That stone slab, he could not look at it anymore. Although he had his doubts, why was the crow ancestor able to openly bring back part of Shi Zhao's inheritance while he was in danger? Could it be related to the core and non-core? However, the strange thing about this mission was that he did not know where the trap was. Now, he finally had some clues. Fortunately, he wasn't someone who couldn't keep his cool. Fortunately, Mu Nan kept pestering him, which gave him some kind of reminder. It should be waiting for him here. Shi Zhao's core secret inheritance, invincible close combat sword techniques, ingenious mission arrangements, mutual appreciation, and tens of thousands of years of sword techniques entrusted to him. When all of these were gathered together, no cultivator would be able to resist such a temptation. Not to mention a swordsman. Everything was going according to the flow of water. Lu Xiaoyi sneered in his heart, reminding himself that as his realm increased, and with his current high-profile behavior, his every move would be magnified in the eyes of some people with ulterior motives. He could not change his current high-profile behavior. This was the foundation of gathering momentum. Otherwise, he could not imagine how a nameless person could make his voice heard in the changing universe. However, he could not make a crucial mistake. This was his principle. As for Shi Zhao's close combat sword skills, he was not very concerned. The main reason why these Shi Zhao swordsmen could achieve this was because of their fusion with the sword spirit, and it was precisely this point that was the most unacceptable, because it would affect the upper realm. If such sword skills were really passed to Xianyuan, what would happen? Those primordial spirit and Yin spirit who could not reach the upper realm would fuse with their sword spirit. Not only could they live forever, but they could also continue to serve the sect. It sounded like killing 2 birds with 1 stone, the best of both worlds, but in reality, if one looked further, one would realize that. Because with this path, one would no longer have the determination to reach the upper realm of life and death. There would be fewer and fewer young spirits and, of course, fewer and fewer demi-immortals, a sword sect that had lost its ambition. Was it still a sword sect? Such a heart was punishable. Chapter 1686. P.S. Just chatting with my friends. Sword Soldier reached its peak in April with the help of the Golden Alliance. Now, it has dropped out of the top 100 in terms of sales and out of the top 20 in terms of categories. This is really embarrassing. Old Depraved has been writing his novel diligently without taking any shortcuts. Who would have thought that he could not stop the trend of the current trend? This is really embarrassing. I have never slacked off, and my updates are not bad. The quality of my novel is not bad either. Everything is on par. But the result is still the same. I feel a little helpless. I don't ask for anything else, but for those who read pirated versions of my novel, please subscribe to my novel. Actually, this is not a matter of money. It's a matter of habit. A few dollars a month is not even enough for you to eat breakfast. Who would care about that? Come and support Old Depraved in the next app. Let me know that I'm still alive. Your support is the author's motivation. Without motivation, there will be no updates and no mood. Thank you for your support. Don't underestimate your subscription. To the author, it is a source of affirmation. Under such circumstances, Lu Xiaoyi still found a way to relax. Sword duel. Sword duel with 4 Western Zhao swordsmen. Of course, they could not use real swords. Instead, they each used a wooden branch as a sword. This was a necessary precaution. Because they were no longer cultivators, they did not have the true Kong to protect themselves. They also did not have the ability to control their strength. If they wanted to have fun, they could only use wooden swords. Sparks flew, and sparks flew. They were so close that they could not afford to be careless. It was also a different kind of feeling. When he fought with a few old swordsmen who had been fighting with swords for tens of thousands of years, even someone as strong as Lu Xiaoyi was turned into an idiot by the wooden swords. The reason why he could perfectly suppress Bei Kuei was because of some other reasons. His aura sword and his body could break the sword at any time, but now none of these could help him anymore. It was normal for him to be defeated by others. He had only been a swordsman for thousands of years. The difference between them was undeniable. Again, Light Illumination's loss was not unjustified. Fighting was the best way to learn. Just like that, Lu Xiaoyi took root in Splendid Land. After experiencing the interception of the connecting passages again and again, his learning ability was abnormally strong, and he quickly familiarized himself with everything. His role in this was no different from that of the Western Zhao swordsman. He finally understood the purpose of sending him here. As mortals, in order to defend against the invasion of the otherworldlings, they had to have the most basic number of people. 5 was already the minimum. If they were to encounter a larger group attack, they might not be able to do it without missing a single person. As for when the mission would end, it would depend on when the guy on the back would realize the responsibility he was shouldering. It might take 10 years or even 100 years. 10 years later, the official missions had become dull and boring. On the contrary, the name of Miaofeng Mountain had become more and more famous among the tribes and clans of the Gale Plain. This was because the first batch of disciples, such as Sherbao, had already made a name for themselves in the Gale Plain. This was a very good example. Their reputation was mainly expressed in their martial arts. Gradually, their reputation began to spread inland, attracting more and more people from the Jianghu. This was not something Lu Xiaoyi could control. In comparison, Munan was even more impressive. The Chuanjin sect had not only made a name for themselves in the Gale Plain, but also in the Yanzhao Plain. However, it was not because of their martial arts, but because of their more profound, more comprehensive, and more extensive Taoist philosophy. The introduction of basic concepts such as the 5 elements, yin and yang, tai chi, 8 trigrams, and so on greatly enriched the local Taoist ideology of Jinxiu. Munan was overjoyed because he could become a benchmark figure in the mainland. Even the Mu family supported him. The vision of the aristocratic families in the Central Plains in the interior of the mainland was much greater than learning swordsmanship. However, to Lu Xiaoyi, The only benefit of having a good reputation was that he did not have to worry about food and drink. The people of the Western Zhao Plain were indeed very persistent. Perhaps it was because they had too much to bear, or perhaps it was because their hearts were dead. Therefore, even though it was a very simple matter to improve their living conditions, they had not thought about it for tens of thousands of years. As expected of the general's disciples, their willpower was as strong as steel. However, he did not care about that. After all, the heavenly eye did not have any special requirements in this area. Why couldn't he fight for a better living environment for himself? The things that were spread were not Xuanyuans, but Taoists, so no one could have anything against him. Tranquility was the most direct feeling Lu Xiaoyi had towards this place. Even in the void of the universe, he could feel that he was a member of the cultivation world. However, here, the atmosphere isolated everything. Not only was there spiritual opportunity, but there were also countless implications. He had always thought that he could adapt to any environment. However, after more than 10 years here, even he felt a little bored, as if he had been abandoned by the world. He had been excluded from the cultivation world of the universe. The Western Zhao swordsmen had persevered here for tens of thousands of years. In their tranquility, he could feel that something that had not yet been extinguished was waiting for someone to ignite it. It should not be like this. Although they had only known each other for a short period of time, he felt angry for them in his heart. Sooner or later, all of this would be repaid. The 5 of them ran through the passageway. No one spoke. This was actually their normal situation. Lu Xiaoyi's initial novelty had already passed. He was now as experienced as a Western Zhao swordsman who had been here for tens of thousands of years. There was nothing left to teach him. This was the 4th time, the 18th year. Everything was the same as before. Boring missions and boring killings. However, after they ran for dozens of miles, they all discovered something strange. The passageway is widening. I remember that the width here should be 13 feet. Now, it's at least 15 feet. Rogi said in a low voice. Fu Shi said without hesitation, hurry up. I hope that the opening we're guarding won't widen too much. While running, Lu Xiaoyi cautiously gave his opinion. The widening of the passageway is nothing. At most, it'll make it harder for us to guard it. What I'm worried about is whether new branches will appear as the passageway widens. If they appear in front of us, it won't matter. But if they appear behind us, Lu Xiaoyi's words alarmed them. What he meant was, based on the fundamental principle of space theory, when the passageway was unstable, a main passageway could be divided into many small branches like a spider web. Most of them could be dead ends. However, as long as one of them was passable, their defense would be meaningless. This was not for the so-called mission, but for the mortals they were guarding. Should they continue to guard the narrow opening? Or should they retreat until the passageway became stable? Fu Shi asked anxiously. If we retreat, it'll be easy for us to slip through. Lu Xiaoyi insisted. It may not be that bad. The appearance of the spider web is a double-edged sword. Most of the foreign species may not be able to find the right path. Therefore, we may have less pressure in terms of numbers. And I always think that even if there are some gaps, at least we can know how many there are. It'll be easier to find them. It's better than not knowing how many there are. The Shizhao swordsmen looked at each other and made a decision. The Xianyuan man's analysis was very reasonable. Under such changes, it would be too passive to stick to the previous strategy. They didn't know if there would be a small passageway more than 200 miles behind them. If they had a hard time guarding the front, and a few small openings appeared behind them, it would be a big sin. Turn back. For safety's sake, we'll go straight back until we see the entrance. At least this time, we can't make any mistakes. As for the next time, it depends on how many people the heavenly eyes send. The 5 of them turned around and started running back. For them, the safest place to be was at the entrance of the passageway. Even if it wasn't easy to defend, at least they could know the exact situation. Chapter 1687. Their decision was very timely. Just as they ran back for more than 10 miles, the tunnel suddenly spasmed, and a small crack appeared on the wall of the tunnel, which was still expanding. Although no strange creatures came out, it was only a matter of time. They were very lucky to have made the right decision. They were even more determined to return to defend. Only when they were close to the entrance did the walls of the passageway gradually stabilize. The passageway was several tens of feet wide, and for the 5 of them, it was difficult to stop every single one of the foreign creatures that were charging at them. They had no choice but to do their best. After assigning their respective areas to guard, they knew that it would take some time for the foreign creatures to arrive. They could finally take a breather. Su found joy in the midst of hardship. This place is not bad. If we are close to the entrance, the food problem will be solved. Lu Xiaoyi asked, "Has this happened before?" Fu Su shook his head. "No, this is the first time. It seems that the collapse of the 5 Taishang has also started to affect this place. After this, if the higher-ups still want to maintain the safety of the beautiful world, they will have to send more people. We just have to guard this place. It won't be considered a dereliction of duty." Lu Xiaoyi had some thoughts, but it was not convenient for him to speak in detail because he did not have any solid evidence. According to his guess, based on the appearance of the zombies in the King Zombie world and the tide of crawling insects on the fruit plate, the tunnel was probably already riddled with holes. However, the Shizhao swordsman was limited in number, so in the past 10,000 years, they did not have the opportunity to explore. The entire tunnel was thousands of miles long. The weakest part should be in the middle. They had been guarding within 200 miles. They did not know the truth about the tunnel until now, when the changes in the tunnel began to spread to the 2 ends. What happened in the middle? It was not that Lu Xiaoyi was a busybody, but his life in the past 20 years had been too boring. According to his understanding, the chaos that appeared in various parts of the universe should have something to do with this place. The battle of the universe was also a battle of luck. The so-called battle was not only about fighting and killing, but also one's contribution. To him, it was fine if he did not know about the changes here, but now that he knew, there was no reason for him to let it go. What was going with the flow? This was what a cultivator would experience in their journey of cultivation. When all these strange things gradually pointed in one direction, you had to take a good look in that direction. This was taking advantage of the situation. If you pretend not to know, then fine, the guidance of the heavenly Tao should be given to someone else. It has nothing to do with you, because you are a person who is unwilling to bear the responsibility. So he comforted her. Actually, it doesn't seem to be a big deal. The collapse of the 5 manifestations had affected many things. After accumulating for a long time, they took advantage of the fact that the blockage had disappeared to launch an attack. This was in line with the basic principles of existence of this type of spatial passage, so it wasn't strange at all. It's like a newly formed spider web, and it's shaped like a maze with a myriad of threads. Even if we were to explore the path within it, it wouldn't be easy for us to find the correct path in the end, let alone those foreign species. Therefore, the possibility of a large number of foreign species coming here is not high. It is more likely that they will come in groups of 30 to 20. Fu Qiu nodded. This judgment was very reliable. Lily is right, but our strategy cannot be too passive in this situation. We can't just stand here and wait. We have to take the initiative to attack. Take advantage of the time when they are poking their heads out to look around, and don't give them a chance to gather. The few of them discussed and decided to look for the best position to block the attack. Finally, after many choices, they decided on 2 positions. One was a 3-way junction about 10 miles away from the entrance. There were 3 people stationed there, which was their last line of defense. The other was 30 miles away from the entrance. There were 4 cracks here, and 2 people were stationed there. Considering that not every crack would have foreign species coming out, if they took the initiative to attack, they could still deal with it. Lu Xiaoyi and Entering Nightmare were placed 30 miles away. This was just a tactical arrangement. To the 5 of them, their strength was more or less the same. There was no situation where one of them was more or less stronger than the other. If they really fought, they could just rotate after a period of time. They were all veterans and knew very well what they should do. Entering Nightmare sighed. The changes in the universe have affected this place in the end. Being in the universe, There is no place to escape. I think that if this passage changes a few more times, there might be half-immortals coming from the other side. If that's really the case, do you think we should stop them? Lu Xiaoyi smiled. Don't think so much.
You won't wait until that day.
The Heaven's Eyes can send people here occasionally, which means that they have never stopped paying attention to this place. After this time, a large number of reinforcements will arrive. How to completely block this passage is something they should consider. As the two of them chatted, time slowly passed. Finally, a reptile poked its head out of a crack and looked around. Entering the crack, Nightmare chased it for 1,000 feet and beheaded it with his sword. This was their strategy. They didn't give these things a chance to gather together and boost their courage. If the foreign species didn't form a large scale, then even if the terrain was wider, they could block them as much as possible. They didn't need to block all of them in this place. They could still let some pass. There were still 3 people behind them. Humans had an absolute advantage in intelligence, and it really played a big role here. To the foreign species that bred in the connecting passage, they basically didn't have much intelligence. Although there were many half-immortals in the inner and western scenic skies, the number of deaths every year was limited. Their powerful magic objects also had a limit, and it was still within a controllable range. After a few months, blocking them was still considered easy. Because of the appearance of the crack, the arrival of the foreign species became chaotic. In addition, they took the initiative to attack, so the battle was actually easier than before. During this period, they rotated once. Lu Xiaoyi and Entering Nightmare retreated to the back. They actually had the opportunity to go out and carry a few roasted lambs back. Gradually, they put down their worries. If this continued, there wouldn't be a problem with the defense this time. After another rotation, Lu Xiaoyi and Entering Nightmare were once again at the front. The two of them were already familiar with this task and had a tacit understanding. When one of them entered the crack to hunt, the other guarded the main road. After more than 10 days, they actually didn't let a single foreign species pass. In the calm, everything was going according to plan. However, Lu Xiaoyi didn't have the slightest bit of carelessness. As a wily old fox who had been in the universe for a long time, he was very clear that often a mutation would occur in a seemingly normal rhythm and catch you off guard. In their place, other than the main road, there were 4 other cracks. Among them, foreign species frequently appeared in one of them. Another one occasionally appeared, and the other 2 never had any foreign species. They should be 2 dead ends. In the defense, one of the 2 dead ends suddenly had movement. A zombie poked its head out. Lu Xiaoyi leaped up and quickly forced it back into the crack. Then, he chased after it and shouted, "Senior brother, be careful. This one has also become a living path." Entering Nightmare replied, "I know. Junior brother, don't chase too far." Chapter 1688. Lu Xiaoyi rose and fell quickly, a little like the qigong of the mortal world. He had not experienced such a feeling for more than 1,000 years, and it was quite interesting. It was also because he had to use the qigong of the mortal world that it was a little difficult to chase after the enemy. He did not give up because the enemy was a zombie and moved relatively slowly. If it was a 4-legged insect, there was a 50% chance that he would not be able to catch up because the two of them had to ensure that the chase was within a certain distance. If the enemy ran too far, they would not be able to keep chasing. The furthest he had gone was 2 to 3 li. But this time, he clearly didn't need such a long time. In less than 1,000 feet, the back of the zombie's neck was cut, and it fell to the ground. Its limbs were still twitching unconsciously. Lu Xiaoyi habitually glanced around and was about to return. At this moment, a vague shadow in front of him stopped him. It was a strange creature that he had never seen in the past 20 years. It was white and almost transparent, with a vague shape, the shape of a sword, patrolling in front of him. It was not a soul. Lu Xiaoyi immediately made a judgment. Before he could get close, Qinggong's shout came from the other side of the crack. "Junior brother, come back quickly. This crack passage is not stable." Lu Xiaoyi also noticed it, But from his position, it was obvious that he did not see it as clearly as Qinggong. The short time between Qinggong's shout and the closing of the passage may be enough for a cultivator to get out, but for a warrior with a mortal body, he would need at least 10 breaths of time to run. It was too late. He was blocked by the collapsed space passage. Perhaps he was very close to Qinggong, but this distance was like a natural moat to them. Lu Xiaoyi did not panic. His attitude towards things that he could not do anything about was very simple. He just had to get used to it. After all, this was not a real crack in space, and the spiderweb was limited. No matter where he went, the possibility of finding the main path was very high. There was no way out, of course. He had to satisfy his curiosity. He would not wait here to see if the crack would open again. Taking the initiative was the mark of a swordsman, especially after seeing the suspected sword spirit. He didn't chase after it as he was afraid of startling it. Instead, he followed it and slowly approached it, quietly observing it. He was still a little uncertain. He was very clear about the state of human cultivators after they were sealed. He also had a certain understanding of insects and zombies. But for things like sword spirits, if they were also sealed, what other abilities did they have? What are its characteristics? He really wasn't too sure about this. The sword vein was a very rare orthodoxy in the universe cultivation world. However, no matter how rare it was, if all the sword vein half-immortals in the universe were gathered in the inner and outer scenic skies, the number would not be too small. Therefore, he did not consider whether this sword spirit came from a senior in Xianyuan. The probability of this happening was actually very small. What he really wanted to know was how many other sword spirits existed in this passageway. He never thought that all the magic objects of the half-immortals wanted to escape and bring disaster to the human world. Many of them just wanted to pursue simple freedom, but the few of them couldn't distinguish all of this. Most of those who died in their hands were purely acting on instinct, but there were also some who were different. This was a dead knot. From the perspective of a living cultivator, it wasn't wrong to not allow these beings to escape. The sword spirit, let's call it that for the time being. It didn't rush towards him with bared fangs and brandished claws as soon as it saw him. Instead, it floated in front of him, seemingly aimless. Lu Xiaoyi controlled his impatience and followed it all the way until the distance between them was extremely close. They began to walk side by side. It was indeed a sword spirit. When they got closer, Lu Xiaoyi finally confirmed the sharp aura that couldn't be concealed. The sword spirit also didn't attack him because he, who was holding the 7 ant, emitted the same aura. In this regard, they were regarded as the same kind of aura. The problem was that they couldn't communicate. For magic objects like the sword spirit, when they were sealed, apart from losing most of their abilities, they would also be deprived of their spiritual intelligence. They would only be left with some instinctive consciousness. This was the difference between magic objects and living creatures. For example, insects, zombies, demonic beasts, and so on, they had real brains that could think simply, mouths that could roar and make sounds, and eyes that could see things and distinguish shapes. However, if it was a sword spirit, it actually didn't have these hardware. Therefore, when it was suppressed to a mortal form, it could only rely on its instincts. However, a sword spirit also had its own unique characteristics. For example, it was different from other magic objects. This was something that only belonged to a sword, even if it was an ordinary sword, recognized by the heavenly Tao. Therefore, in this sword spirit's perception, it might not think that Lu Xiaoyi was a human. It might not even know what a human was, what a reptile was, or what other things were. The only thing it knew was that the person beside it was as sharp as it was. This was something that Lu Xiaoyi slowly discovered along the way. There was no way to communicate with it at all, because the sword spirit's consciousness was already considered something that didn't belong to it, and was sealed. The only thing that could be done was to fight alongside it. The sword spirit liked to find trouble with insects the most, followed by zombies, and then demonic beasts. However, it was almost indifferent to spiritual bodies, puppets, and treasure spirits. It had a very strong sense of hatred. No matter how many of such existences there were in front of it, it would rush forward and hack at them. Because it was an illusory form of energy, and its swordsmanship was very regular, and it didn't have a sword wielder. Its attacks were extremely bold and unrestrained. It was far more ferocious than Lu Xiaoyi's sword. This was incomparable because the sword spirit's swordsmanship was completely different from when it had a master. It didn't have any scruples and could do whatever it wanted. When the sword spirit showed its combat form, the entire sword was no longer illusory, but had completely solidified into a long sword. However, the attentive Lu Xiaoyi had already discovered that there were innumerable cracks on the sword's body. Those were caused by the lack of energy caused by the prolonged fighting, which caused the sword spirit to be unable to solidify into a complete long sword. In the long run, there would be a day when it would completely disappear. However, this sword spirit didn't care about this at all. Instead, it was searching everywhere and fighting everywhere. There wasn't a moment when it was idle. What could he do? The only thing he could do was to help the sword spirit as much as possible when it was fighting and try his best to share its burden. He hoped that the day when this lousy sword would break would come even later. He also understood that the sword spirit's wandering around the crack wasn't because it wanted to rush out, but because it wanted to tail and kill that zombie. Were there any more existences like the sword spirit in the passageway? There definitely were. However, there were definitely very few of them. Not only did they inherit their master's abilities, they also inherited their master's beliefs. Such existences were not only limited to the sword spirit. In the process of following the sword spirit, he also discovered existences that were doing the same thing as the sword spirit. For example, the life weapons of magic cultivators. Even in death, the remains of these powerful cultivators were still doing the things that their masters hadn't finished. It was very moving. Chapter 1689. The sword spirit did not have its own intelligence, only the instinct to kill. Fortunately, this instinct was selective, probably due to the influence of its master's actions over a long period of time, deeply engraved in its instincts. But it also had a temper. This was manifested in many aspects. First, Lu Xiaoyi could not kill more than it. If he killed more than it would not be happy. If it was unhappy, it would not care about the existence beside it and would run around to vent its dissatisfaction. At first, Lu Xiaoyi didn't quite understand why this guy suddenly became so irritable. Later, he realized that it was his fault. Therefore, every time he fought, he would deliberately give way to the sword spirit. Therefore, the sword spirit was very satisfied. Secondly, this fellow liked to be a teacher. It had its own insistence on how to use the sword. This was a habit it had developed over thousands of years under its master's control. It had to admit that there were many incredible sword techniques worth learning, but this did not mean that Lu Xiaoyi had to copy them all. Moreover, it was now purely in the form of a sword, and there were many sword techniques that Lu Xiaoyi could not learn. He had an additional body, so of course he had to be careful and not throw himself into a group of strange creatures. The sword spirit could not understand the difference between them, so it instinctively thought that its companion was not brave enough. This was also something that could not be helped. Finally, this fellow always had the attitude of a big brother, a leader, and a senior brother. For example, if they met a fork in the road, it would turn right, and Lu Xiaoyi could not turn left. If Lu Xiaoyi insisted, this fellow would not change its choice. If both of them insisted, they could only go their separate ways. There was no other way. After trying a few times, Lu Xiaoyi would always compromise and follow it. The only thing that comforted him was that this arrogant fellow would not reveal anything and slow down to wait for him. It was also a person who cared about face. Lu Xiaoyi naturally did not care about face. A senior swordsman, a half-immortal existence, and a sword expert with a lifespan of at least 10,000 years. What face did a junior like him have? He was just a stubborn old man. At the last moment of his life, he didn't mind being the old man's attendant one more time. It was impossible to guess the origin of this sword spirit because all the cultivator's sword skills had been sealed. The only thing that could be used was the close-range sword. Close-range sword skills were actually no different to most cultivators of the sword vein. It was more about personal preference. Only the sword skills of the Western Bright Sword Mansion that were integrated with the sword spirit would have a certain degree of recognition. If it was a human wielding a sword, he could still roughly tell. However, if the sword was wielding itself, it would completely go against the basic principles of human swordsmanship. In that case, it would truly be unrecognizable and completely unfamiliar. This was also the deepest Lu Xiaoyi had ever ventured into the tunnel. He could not tell exactly how deep he had gone. He only knew that he had gone up the main path, then down and up again. He only had one goal, and that was to go wherever there were the most insects. There was a general direction, and it was heading straight in. Perhaps the sword spirit felt that he had a helper this time, and could do what it couldn't do before? The Western Bright Swordsmen had not been to these places for tens of thousands of years. It was not that their spirit of exploration was not enough, but that they were too short of manpower to launch such a reverse push. They had to ensure that none of the strange creatures could rush into the splendid world. To them, this was not an easy task. Of course, they did not have the extra manpower to reverse push. The deeper he went, the more cracks there were in the space. Moreover, most of them appeared to be very stable. Lu Xiaoyi then understood that the connecting tunnel had already started to change. It was just that the humans only occupied a distance of 200 miles, so they did not feel it. The sword spirit was very familiar with the path here. Who knew how many years it had been here? During this process, Lu Xiaoyi truly saw all kinds of strange creatures in this tunnel. There were far more than when he had set up the checkpoints previously. For example, there were rarely seen cultivators' natal treasures when setting up the checkpoints. It was a fact that the reptiles and zombies still cooperated to a certain extent. However, the sword spirit rarely cooperated with these treasures and puppets. They all minded their own business, just like what their masters did when they were alive. This was also a kind of memory and also represented the attitude of their masters in the past. However, their masters still knew how to temporarily borrow and cooperate with each other when they were alive. Even if they did not get along well on the surface, these treasures did not know how to compromise with each other. They just minded their own business. Lu Xiaoyi completely gave up on the idea of going back. In his opinion, instead of wasting a few years in the splendid world doing nothing, he would rather accompany the sword spirit in the tunnel. He could also have a more comprehensive understanding of everything here. There would always be surprises and accidents, and his life would be more fulfilling. This was the pace he liked, rather than teaching Mu Nan, Bao, and the others outside. When he wanted to go back, he could always go back as long as he followed the main road. He finally understood why the Shi Zhao swordsmen could persevere here for tens of thousands of years. It was because there were many existences here who helped them subconsciously, purely out of instinct. After a few months, they arrived at a spacious place. This was no longer a tunnel but a hilly land that was close to 100 miles wide. Just like what Fuli said, there were about 2 or 3 such places in the entire tunnel. They were also the places where reptiles and zombies bred the most. They were the base camp. Zombies could be seen everywhere here, wandering aimlessly. Only a few of them were heading towards the splendid world, and most of them were healthy. Most of the zombies were incomplete and could not bear to go far. However, they were wandering around this spacious land, as if they were waiting for something or looking for something. Lu Xiaoyi could feel that the sword spirit was very excited because the condensed sword force had grown a little longer. After a few months of interaction, he knew that this was the precursor of the sword spirit's attack. The sword spirit was very bold to attack in such a place. Of course, it did not have a body to be killed. At most, it would consume more energy and turn from a broken sword into a broken sword. Should he go crazy with it, or should he leave? Actually, it was not difficult for Lu Xiaoyi to choose. Old man, there are too many zombies here. Although their speed is not good, if they rush up and surround us, I'm afraid that neither of us will be able to escape. Just kill them at the edges and corners. Don't rush in, okay? You have lived long enough, but I haven't. Lu Xiaoyi knew that the sword spirit could not understand his complaints and only took them as a pastime. He did not expect the sword spirit to understand completely. He had his own judgment about these zombies. If he could maintain his speed and charge all the way, it seemed that he could barely do it. However, he could not stop and be surrounded. Otherwise, he would be exhausted to death sooner or later. They were all mortals, so there was always a limit. The sword spirit did not care about him and only wandered around the edges. It looked as if it was looking for a weak point, but it did not seem to be, because it did not conform to Lu Xiaoyi's judgment of the situation. Then, the sword suddenly shook and rushed forward. It cut a slow zombie into two pieces and continued to move forward. Lu Xiaoyi had no choice but to follow, cursing. "Damn old man, I'm going to die because of you." Chapter 1690. The sword spirit was in front and Lu Xiaoyi was at the back, one in front and one in back. If the one in front was a human like senior brother Shi Zhao, he would need to ensure the person's escape route and side. However, the one in front was the sword spirit. This thing didn't have a physical body, so he didn't need to care too much about how to protect it. The most important thing was to maintain the strength of the attack so that the two of them could move forward quickly enough so that they wouldn't be surrounded by the slow-moving zombies. At the same time, he hoped that the sword spirit knew what was good for it and would kill through the zombies and enter the main road on the other side. The sword spirit's attack was indeed sharp, and every time it attacked without hesitation. Lu Xiaoyi's responsibility was to clean up the flanks. This strategy allowed them to move quickly at the beginning, but as they approached the central area, there were more and more zombies and they became more and more concentrated, so their speed slowed down. A radius of nearly 100 miles was not a distance for a practitioner, but for him, it was a long journey of death. Even if he rushed to the central area, he still had to cover a distance of 50 miles. Usually, it would take a lot of time to run this distance, not to mention now that he had to deal with the zombies that had been blown up and were slowly moving towards them. He also finally realized that the so-called hilly area was actually not a hill, but a cave that was half buried and half exposed. There were zombies continuously crawling out from inside. This was a zombie community. What was the sword spirit's purpose? Was it purely for the sake of killing? He began to have doubts in his heart. At the beginning, they only had to face 1 or 2 zombies, but later on there were 4 or 5 zombies. When they rushed out more than 30 miles, there were always dozens of zombies entangling with them. If they couldn't deal with them quickly, there would be more zombies surrounding them. It was already impossible to get off the tiger. At this time, Lu Xiaoyi actually calmed down and rushed forward wholeheartedly. This was the most basic quality of a swordsman. Only by having no distractions could one focus on killing the enemy. The sword spirit became more and more ferocious. Wherever the sword flashed, there were hundreds of rays of brilliance. One must know that this was a sealed sword spirit, so it was somewhat inconceivable for it to do this. Lu Xiaoyi was already side by side with it.
There was no need to care about the back.
If the zombies behind them surrounded them, they would definitely die today. He could only force his way forward. How did he force himself to this point? He was also very curious. It was as if the sword spirit had a strange charm. That kind of loyalty to the sword to the point of death had moved him. Higher-level zombies began to appear. Their bodies were tougher, their reactions more agile, and their strength more powerful. Lu Xiaoyi wasn't sure how the zombies here were categorized, but he didn't really care. Both swords were condensed from sword spirits. However, one of them was illusory and needed to be supplied with energy, while the other was real. As long as the owner had the strength, it would never be damaged. This was a great advantage in battle. Wherever the sword went, it was invincible. He finally saw a huge cave in the direction of the sword spirit, but he wasn't sure if the sword spirit would just pass by it or if it had other intentions. This was a crazy sword spirit. One could only imagine what kind of person its original owner was. But at this moment, the sword blade condensed by the sword spirit had a slight change, as if it had shrunk by half an inch. Although the change was small, it didn't escape Lu Xiaoyi's observation. He knew that the sword spirit was a little weak. At this time, of course, he should step forward bravely. He took the initiative to take most of the pressure, and the sword light in his hand burst out with a bright light. The last time he fought so hard was in the sword Tau steel. He didn't expect that this time he would fight with his mortal body. The world was unpredictable, and it was really unpredictable. The most dangerous battle after reaching the primordial spirit was not against the yang spirit, but against a group of magic objects that had lost their masters. The last part of the road was opened up by Lu Xiaoyi. Finally, he was close to the huge cave. When he was still hesitating whether to step over the hill and rush out of the encirclement, or something else, the sword spirit beside him suddenly let out a sword cry. The sword light soared again, and it plunged into the cave. In a flash, Lu Xiaoyi didn't have time to think carefully. He jumped in, because he believed that a sword spirit of more than 10,000 years would not choose such a brainless death. There must be a reason. As soon as he entered the cave, he immediately seemed to be in another space. The zombies outside jumped around the cave entrance, but didn't dare to follow in, as if there was something here that made them extremely afraid. This was an ancient battlefield. Blood-stained banners, broken swords, scattered armor, and endless corpses. From time to time, an arm stretched out from the soil, and then a broken zombie slowly crawled out. It was the inexplicable ancient battlefield space that could produce zombies that Fu Shi had mentioned. However, they were just speculating, and Lu Xiaoyi saw it with his own eyes. The sword spirit quickly swayed to the center of the battlefield. There was nothing here that could stop the two of them. Most of the newly crawling zombies couldn't even stand steadily, let alone fight. Lu Xiaoyi followed closely behind, and finally found the goal of the sword spirit's adventure. In the center of the battlefield, countless bones were piled up under the war flag, and a huge corpse lotus was in full bloom. There were strange lotuses in the universe, and there was no envy for immortals. The 3 flowers didn't gather at the crown, and the 5 flowers didn't gather at the origin. This poem was talking about the 8 most special lotuses in the universe. They were recognized by both Buddhism and Taoism as good things and great opportunities. Among them, Buddhism was the most important. The lotus was the saint of flowers, symbolizing purity, elegance, tranquility, and transcendence. The lotus was pure and untainted by dirt, symbolizing Buddha and Bodhisattva's transcendence from the mortal world, and the 4 elements were all empty. The lotus would not die, and it would bloom again in the next year, symbolizing that the soul of the dead would not be destroyed, and it would continue to be reincarnated. Buddhism had 8 auspicious treasures: the precious umbrella, the double fish, the precious vase, the lotus, the white conch, the rui scepter, the precious banner, and the golden wheel. However, Buddha placed the lotus in the most noble position. Due to the sacred meaning of the lotus in Buddhism, the Buddhist scriptures called the Buddhist holy flower lotus, the Buddhist kingdom lotus world, the Kasaya lotus clothes, the monks mudra lotus palms, and even Buddha was called the lotus prince. The lotus was the only one among the hundreds of flowers that could coexist with a flower, a fruit, lotus root, and a seed, lotus seed. It symbolized the coexistence of the 3 bodies of Buddha, Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya. The lotus had 5 colors: white, green, red, purple, and yellow, and it was called the 5 heavenly flowers. Among them, white and green were the most popular. It was called the 5 non-Chaoyuan. In other words, if one could possess any of the 5 colored lotuses, he would have the ability similar to that of an immortal. Of course, the possession here was not something that could be obtained by luck, but by condensing one's own power. It also required a lot of effort, and it was called the Lotus Way. It was a very special branch of Buddhism, and it was not something that ordinary monks could hope for. It was a disguised way to become an immortal. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi had only heard of it. At his current level, he could not fully understand these things. Chapter 1691. White Lotus Flower, Sanskrit transliterated as Fentoli. This flower grew in the Buddha kingdom's Anuta pond and was rarely seen in the mortal world. Hence, it was also known as the flower of hope. Green lotus flower, Sanskrit transliterated as ubala. Its leaves were long and narrow, round at the bottom and tapering at the top. The green and white were distinct and resembled Buddha's eyes. Hence, it was known as the lotus eye in the Buddhist scriptures. In Buddhism, each lotus flower had its own meaning. It was something that could not be encountered or sought. It only existed in ideology. The Buddha kingdom was also illusory. Whatever the lotus flower in one's heart was, it was what it was. If one could match the lotus flower in the Buddha kingdom in one's ideology, one would possess some of the abilities of an immortal. Hence, the five-colored lotus flower was not necessarily real. It was just a concept. No one knew what it looked like. It only existed in the hearts of cultivators. However, the three flowers in the phrase, "Three flowers do not gather at one's crown," had its origins. The three flowers were not the three flowers of Taoism. They were referring to three types of lotus flowers: the treasure lotus, the water lotus, and the corpse lotus. The reason why these three types of lotus flowers were the most powerful was not because they had any power. In the cultivation world, using power to understand a treasure was a very low-level concept. If a treasure could only kill someone by throwing it out, then it was not a good treasure. How could there be anything invincible in the cultivation world? Their uniqueness was that they could help cultivators understand the Tao. It was not just a superficial understanding, but a deeper understanding of a certain innate Tao. For example, the treasure lotus contained the innate Tao of time. This was very powerful. Although everyone knew about time, no one was proficient in it. This was why the treasure lotus was so valuable. Another example was the water lotus. The innate Tao it contained was nirvana. It was a Tao exclusive to Buddhism and was very mysterious. Finally, there was the corpse lotus. It did not sound nice, but it was related to a Tao that both Buddhism and Taoism valued greatly: reincarnation. There was no need to elaborate on the importance of reincarnation. Perhaps Yuanian cultivators might not be able to feel it, but perfected monarchs had many uses for it. If one were to walk up to the half-immortal level, the significance of reincarnation would be different. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi did not have a deep understanding of this yet. He was just a newly ascended primordial spirit cultivator and was only in the middle of the perfected monarchs. It was precisely because of the characteristics of the three types of lotus flowers that they were highly regarded in the cultivation world. They were also extremely rare and could only be encountered by chance. They could not be cultivated and could only be grown naturally. The corpse lotus had no roots or stems. It was a strange parasitic creature that lived on the nutrients of rotting corpses. It mostly grew in tombs, ancient battlefields, and other places with dense miasma. Ordinary corpse lotuses still existed in the cultivation world, but if it was a corpse lotus that had fused with the reincarnation Grand Tao, then it was very precious. According to the rules of the heavenly Tao, there could only be one corpse lotus of the same great Tao of reincarnation, and they could not coexist. In the vast universe, where could one find one? With the same logic, there could only be one water lotus that contained the Grand Tao in this world. This showed how precious they were. The huge corpse lotus bloomed in the battlefield and emitted the stench of rotting flesh. It was also because of its existence that the reincarnation Grand Tao played a role in this ancient battlefield. That was why there were so many zombies being born. This was already a very miraculous ability. You couldn't expect it to really be able to bring back flesh and bones from the dead. It wasn't something that could be done by immortal techniques. It was a heaven-defying technique that didn't exist in the cultivation world. In the cultivation world, there were many almighty existences that could change the heaven and earth. However, when it came to life, any responsible heavenly Tao belonged to Yen Jin. It would not be lenient because this was the beginning of a disaster. The smell emitted by the corpse lotus was nauseating. Cultivators could hold their breath and remain unmoved, but mortals could not. Their mouths, noses, and pores could not be closed. That was why Lu Xiaoyi felt very uncomfortable even before he got close. The sword spirit naturally did not care about the smell. He quickly approached and continuously pierced the corpse lotus. The corpse lotus clearly did not have any resistance and could only passively endure the sword spirit's attacks. However, no matter what the sword spirit did, the wounds that were cut would always heal instantly, and the wounds that were pierced would be as good as new. In this sealed environment, the attacks of mortals paled in comparison. In this place, it was almost an indestructible existence. There was still time. Since he was here, he might as well make the best of it. There was no need to think about the problems outside. Holding his breath, he quickly approached the corpse lotus. And quickly slid across the corpse lotus to feel its sturdiness and recovery speed. After a series of actions, Lu Xiaoyi, who was almost unable to hold his breath, jumped away. He paused for a moment to adjust his breathing. He went forward again and tried again. After repeating this several times, he finally understood some of the characteristics of the corpse lotus. It was very troublesome. He came to a few conclusions. First of all, the smell was indeed very unpleasant. Mortals might faint after smelling it for a long time. Even if his constitution was far superior to that of a normal person, there was still a limit. However, the smell was indeed not poisonous and could not kill. It was just a characteristic of the corpse lotus itself. Ordinary corpse lotuses use this stench to attract flies or beetles to spread their pollen. Although this corpse lotus had merged with the great Tao of reincarnation, its essence had not changed. Its smell was countless times stronger than ordinary corpse lotuses. Secondly, the corpse lotus's fleshy petals were at the level of ordinary plants. Not to mention a sharp sword, any kind of hard object could easily cut it open. It was like a layer of juice wrapped in a membrane. As long as the juice flowed out, the power of reincarnation would be produced, and it would naturally heal seamlessly. Finally, just like ordinary corpse lotuses, this damned thing had no roots and no stem. It was impossible to use the most effective method to deal with plants, which was to cut off the roots and stem to get rid of its source of nutrients. Its nutrients came from the ancient battlefield, from the souls of tens of thousands of people who died in battle. These things filled this space and were everywhere. As a mortal, he could not cut off this layer of connection. Lu Xiaoyi kept on trying, but the sword's spirit finally stopped. Perhaps it knew that its attacks were useless, so it simply stood at the side and did not move. It was as if the next problem would be solved by Lu Xiaoyi. That's good. Even if it can't help, at least it won't cause trouble. This is a good quality. This thing must be destroyed. Destroying it would mean destroying the source of zombies, and the universe would be cleared. At least in the king zombie world, no more zombies would appear. He could clearly see that these mutilated corpses were sent to various places in the universe, through the spatial cracks that were everywhere. The king zombie world was definitely not the only destination. As for whether destroying this natural wonder would be a waste of God's gift, he did not care. After all, if this corpse lotus was gone, another one would naturally be born in the universe. It would not be cut off, so there was no need to talk about karma. Who placed this thing here? Was it natural or was it intentional? There was no way to speculate. Maybe the old sword spirit knew? Let's destroy it first. This must be the sword spirit's wish. Chapter 1692. P.S. Looking for monthly votes. I wish everyone a happy holiday. Lu Xiaoyi pondered for a moment and began to make his move. The first move was to see if he could drag the huge corpse lotus out of the ancient battlefield. The corpse lotus was 30 feet in diameter. Purely in terms of weight, Lu Xiaoyi's strength would not be a problem. But in fact, he gave up on this method after few attempts. No matter whether he pushed or pulled, the corpse lotus did not move an inch. This meant that it had a mysterious connection with this space that did not belong to the mortal world. This was not something he could do now. The second move was to carve a corrosive formation. Even though he had been sealed, he didn't have any memories. He hadn't forgotten the strange, inscribed sword formations that he had learned when he was building his foundation. Even though he didn't have any spirit stones or mana, he still had some inner energy. He could activate part of the formation's power to a certain extent. He couldn't use it to kill, but he could still cause trouble. He tried again, but it still ended in failure, because it was impossible to carve anything on the huge petals of the corpse lotus. When the tip of the sword scratched, the petals were covered instantly. There was no chance for the formation to take shape. Cultivation methods could not be used, and the methods of the mortal world were also useless. Lu Xiaoyi fell into deep thought. He needed to make some high-tech things. After many attempts, he found that the secret of the reincarnation of the corpse lotus was probably in the juice of the lotus petals. Perhaps it was not the secret of reincarnation, but the medium that carried the energy of the corpse lotus. Since he could not cut it with a sword, he could only use his mind to take drastic measures. This was an ancient battlefield. Although it was ancient, the special environment allowed the human bones and weapon remains to be relatively intact. They were not eroded by the wind for a long time. Among the countless broken weapons, he found a few well-preserved long weapon grips. He also found a few intact armors and a mace head. He began to make it. First, he used a few weapons to make a fixed frame, which was less than 10 feet away from the corpse lotus. Then, he used the mace head as a shaft and placed it horizontally. There was no bearing. That thing was too delicate and was not something he could make now. So, he just used it. After dismantling a few sets of armor, he used his long sword to cut out 6 or 7 pieces of equal size. After bending them slightly, he fixed them onto the spikes of the mace, forming a simple device with the mace as the axis and 7 pieces of leaves on it. The most troublesome part was how to seal it. There had to be a suitable water inlet pipe. As for whether there was an outlet pipe or not, it didn't matter, right? This was a thick iron spear shaft. It was unknown which general had used it to be so thick. He needed to hollow out the middle to form a hollow pipe, which was obviously difficult to do with the 7 ants. Although it could melt iron like mud, it was not long enough. Lu Xiaoyi looked at the sword spirit, who had nothing to do. This thing was a standard drill. In the end, it was a crude water pump. Fortunately, he did not need the lift, nor did he need the flow, nor did he need it to be sturdy and durable. He had come into contact with these things in his previous life. It was from a small shop that specialized in water pumps that he became familiar with. There were countless loopholes. Fortunately, he did not need to draw water from the bottom of the well. There was not even a difference in height. There was really no other way. If he was immortal, then he could only rely on the limited mechanical knowledge he had in his previous life. In theory, inserting a pipe and sucking in a mouthful of water seemed to be a good method. However, the juice of the corpse lotus was rather viscous. Moreover, he did not want to drink a mouthful of corpse lotus juice. The nutrients of this thing were too disgusting. It took him a few days to finish this set of things. He could not make it too detailed. He did not even have a pair of pliers on hand, so he had to make do with it. No matter what, this was a great attempt. It was a challenge from an industrial civilization to a cultivation civilization. He did not have much confidence. The only good news was that this corpse lotus did not have the ability to fight back. Perhaps in a different cultivation environment, it would have the ability to defend itself. However, in this place it was a big flower. The shaft of the spear, which was the water inlet pipe, had been fixed. The entire device was like an iron pulley. A spear handle extended from the front, and the tip was cut into a sharp wedge. Lu Xiaoyi pushed this thing forward. Under the tremendous force, the sharp wedge was inserted into the several feet thick petals of the corpse lotus. Lu Xiaoyi jumped up and grabbed the handle he had made himself. He bent his waist and began to shake with all his might. His hands were dancing in the air. After dozens of breaths, not a single drop of juice flowed out from the mouth. He could only give up. What had gone wrong with this terrible operation? He withdrew from the device and looked at the sharp wedge at the entrance. Some of the juice had already solidified. This was a self-protection mechanism of the corpse lotus. It was like platelets to blood. It could not keep flowing. There had to be a special biological function to prevent it from flowing out. The key point was that before the juice solidified, he did not have enough suction force to suck it out. His intuition was that the rotation speed was too slow. The industrial civilization used electric motors, while the cultivation civilization used magical power. He had nothing at the moment. How high could the rotation speed be if he only relied on the strength of a mortal? He once again looked at the sword spirit. Wasn't this the best electric motor? No matter how fast he spun, he wouldn't get dizzy, right? They had been together for a long time. They could be considered to have the most basic communication. Moreover, he had demonstrated it before. It was not difficult for the sword spirit to understand such an action. The sword spirit was somewhat reluctant, but it recognized this companion, so it could only reluctantly do it. Although it always felt that this thing was a little strange, its root could not be wrong. It was a comrade of the sword vein. After removing the membrane at the sharp wedge, he once again stabbed the long shaft into the corpse lotus. When the sword spirit turned the handle, the rotation speed was not something Lu Xiaoyi could compare with. It was several orders of magnitude faster. It felt like a low-quality, second-hand electric motor. The idea was beautiful, but the reality was cruel. After dozens of breaths, there was still no movement at the entrance. Lu Xiaoyi had to stop the sword spirit, who was spinning crazily. This fellow's speed was really fast. He was worried that his crew device would fall apart. What was the problem? Was the seal not good? He admitted that the seal was not good enough, but he did not ask for too much. It was not like he wanted to draw a deep well or raise a river. He deliberately made the device very low, even lower than the petals of the corpse lotus. If it was water, it would have flowed out by itself, right? Water? Lu Xiaoyi realized a small oversight. It was basic knowledge. He took out the 2 large leather water bags on his back. There was no water inside. There was no water in this damned place. It was the blood of insects. In this place, he could only rely on this to quench his thirst. He carefully poured the blood into the water inlet until the entire inlet was filled. Then, he gradually filled up the leaves. Because of the seal problem, there were traces of blood leaking from the joints. Fortunately, it was not serious. After the vase was filled, he no longer hesitated. With a strong push, the shaft once again stabbed into the corpse lotus petals. At the same time, the sword spirit quickly spun. Chapter 1693. P.S. Looking for guaranteed monthly votes. This time, there was finally juice spurting out. Because there was no outlet at all, it was directly spurting out from the side of the cylinder. Moreover, the juice was also flowing out from the seams, splashing everywhere. The strong smell made Lu Xiaoyi hold his breath, but the sword spirit didn't care. Seeing that there was an effect, it became more and more excited. Lu Xiaoyi didn't stay idle either. Holding his sword, he began to slash at the corpse lotus crazily, causing it as much damage as possible. This corpse lotus, because of the special environment, although it didn't have the power to resist, it was actually very safe. It was safer than when it had the ability to defend itself in the outside world. This was because this place was full of strange creatures, all zombies that it had reincarnated. They were densely packed and stacked layer upon layer. It was very difficult for any enemy to break in. Even if an enemy really broke in, they would be at the level of a mortal. How could they cause harm to an existence like it? Just his self-healing ability alone was not something that could be shaken by a mortal body. But now, it met a mortal who didn't take the usual path. Under the double blow, the corpse lotus finally began to wither after a while. It shouldn't be so weak, but the sealed environment also had an effect on it. This was equal. No existence here could be special. The main effect was the loss of juice from the corpse lotus. At this time, Lu Xiaoyi finally understood. What was being lost was not the reincarnation realm, but the vitality of the corpse lotus itself. To completely destroy it, he couldn't just rely on the body of the lotus to kill it. He also needed to fuse with its realm. This was very simple for him when he was a cultivator, but it was basically impossible for him as a mortal. He wasn't tempted by such a temptation. He was no longer a novice, and he had more than 10 realm cultivators on his back. He had a strong tolerance in this aspect, and he wouldn't do any unnecessary actions because of greed. Destroying the corpse lotus and removing the root of the zombie's resurrection was his only goal. The corpse lotus was powerless to resist. Its petals withered and drooped down, but it still needed a fatal blow. In this aspect, Lu Xiaoyi wasn't sure what he should do. Because he wasn't a primordial spirit now, and it wasn't just a matter of ability but also a matter of perception. He could only try his best to weaken it, and weaken it even more. Only then could he see it more clearly. But he didn't wait until the moment when he completely understood. The sword spirit continuously drew out the juice of the corpse lotus as it spun crazily. It spun faster and faster until the defective product created by Lu Xiaoyi suddenly broke into pieces. The sword spirit didn't hesitate. A wisp of sword light burst out and plunged into the pistil of the corpse lotus that had been cut by Lu Xiaoyi a long time ago. It seemed as if it had cut something. In just an instant, the struggling corpse lotus suddenly stopped resisting. It was as if it had been weathered away, fusing with the yellow ground and disappearing without a trace. A strange howl seemed to be heard. At this moment, all the zombies that were still crawling out of the ancient battlefield stopped moving. Some returned to the ground, while others dragged half of their bodies and wriggled in the battlefield. Everything was over. Lu Xiaoyi and Sword Spirit left the space one after another. The countless zombies outside were all dumbfounded. They didn't want to kill anymore. Taking advantage of the zombies' stupefied state, they quickly passed through the zombies and arrived at the other end of the main road. He could feel that the sword spirit had lost a lot of energy after going through such a huge battle. He could replenish his energy through food, but the sword spirit could not. It was a body of energy. In such an environment, there was no way it could replenish itself. Moreover, for a sword spirit, even in the outside world of cultivation, it could not replenish itself. This was because the only way it could replenish itself was through its master. Since the sword cultivator was gone, the sword spirit could not last long. What Lu Xiaoyi found strange was that although the battle was very intense, if the sword spirit had lost so much in such a battle, it could be imagined that the sword spirit's reserves were limited. It probably didn't have much time left in the future. As for how the sword spirit broke the reincarnation Tao of the corpse lotus, he didn't care. After all, the sword spirit was different from him. It had extraordinary senses even in such an environment. What it could sense, he couldn't, so there was no need for him to get to the bottom of it. He couldn't ask, so there was no way to communicate. As they continued forward, the sword spirit didn't slow down at all. It even seemed to be in a hurry. What was the sword spirit in such a hurry for? This time, the sword spirit's behavior was different from before. It didn't take the initiative to attack the strange creatures they encountered. Those that didn't provoke the two of them were let off lightly. It only attacked those that were in the way and those that provoked them. In this connecting passage, the sword spirit wasn't the only one looking for trouble with other strange creatures. Other strange creatures also looked for trouble with the sword spirit. They were enemies and couldn't tolerate each other. Lu Xiaoyi didn't care whether the sword spirit was happy or not. He began to take the initiative to take on the responsibility of fighting. What surprised him was that the sword spirit also stopped fighting, as if it had tacitly approved of his actions. It was like an old man who, after seeing his younger generation grow up, finally put away his pride and unyielding heart, allowing the younger generation to take on the responsibility that originally belonged to them. Finally, it knew that it was old. Along the way, they overcame all difficulties. Nothing could stop the sharpness of the two swords. Most of the time, Lu Xiaoyi could handle it alone. Occasionally, when there were more opponents, the sword spirit would come to help. The man and the sword kept moving forward with such tacit understanding, never stopping. Lu Xiaoyi didn't know where the sword spirit was taking him, but he knew that the sword spirit must have its instinctive intentions, and it definitely wouldn't harm him. Over the past few days, although the sword spirit hadn't blocked a single attack for him, he could feel some things that didn't need to be explained with words. The sword vein of the universe was like a family. He deeply understood this point. For a sword spirit who had been lonely here for who knew how many years, the joy of meeting a companion was irreplaceable. Even if it was a swordsman, they still needed to support each other. This was what it meant to be a human. Their speed was getting faster and faster because those who wanted to go to the mortal world to seek freedom had already set off. Most of the remaining people didn't have any urgent needs in this aspect. Moreover, the probability of bumping into Earthcrawlers was getting higher and higher. 7 or 8 out of 10 otherworldlings were Earthcrawlers. This gave Lu Xiaoyi a bad premonition. Did the sword spirit think that after defeating the zombies, it could start all over again with the help of Earthcrawlers? He didn't care too much. These days, whether it was from Shi Zhao's senior brothers or the sword spirit, he had learned a lot of very practical close combat sword skills. There was nothing more effective than learning and killing enemies at the same time. He was just worried that the sword spirit's old arms and legs wouldn't be able to resist a fierce battle. Earthcrawlers and zombies were no different in terms of fighting power, but they were undoubtedly more dangerous because they had many legs. In terms of speed, zombies couldn't compare at all. This was also the biggest danger for them. Once they were surrounded, the chances of escaping were slim. Chapter 1694. P.S. Looking for guaranteed monthly votes. Sure enough, as Lu Xiaoyi expected, the next open area they came to was the territory of the Earthcrawlers. Lu Xiaoyi finally had a rough idea of his current position in the passage. According to senior brother Shi Zhao, the area where the Earthcrawlers gathered was more than half the way, which meant that he had now crossed the middle line of the passage. He was still wandering around the edge. Lu Xiaoyi knew that it couldn't hear him, but he still kept complaining. Old thing. You can't go through here. Unless you want to leave your old bones here. In the end, the dissipated energy of the sword spirit benefited these Earthcrawlers. I'm telling you, I won't accompany you. If you want to go, you have to go by yourself. You're already an adult. How can you not understand the gravity of the situation? Lu Xiaoyi was nagging here, but the sword spirit was wandering in front of him, just like when it attacked the zombies. It was probably looking for an angle to wedge in. It was a bit suicidal. What he couldn't understand was that in the zombies' territory, one could achieve the goal of eliminating the zombies by destroying the corpse lotus. Then, would there be such a core in the Earthcrawlers' territory? Or was there an insect queen? Was this possible? Lu Xiaoyi was very clear about the horror of an insect queen. He also didn't think that there would be a cultivator raising such a thing. If it was just an ordinary mating between a male and female, how could it be cut off? What was the point of rushing in? However, the sword spirit didn't listen to his advice. The sword spirit had been wandering around, wandering in the area where the Earthcrawlers were the thinnest. The intensity of the battle wasn't high, but Lu Xiaoyi was constantly on tenterhooks. He wasn't worried about himself, but he was worried that the sword spirit wouldn't be able to resist. This kind of worry continued until they slipped to the other side of the main road. Then, the sword spirit sped up and ran into the depths of the main road. Lu Xiaoyi then realized that the sword spirit wasn't as stupid as he thought. It also knew when to take the initiative and when to retreat. It was a smart old thing. He had underestimated the sword spirit. As time went on, the chances of encountering mutants became lower and lower. It appeared that these creatures were also very territorial. Zombies were extinct, and reptiles were rare. However, the number of creatures that gradually increased were those that didn't have the ability to reproduce, such as spiritual entities, pet beasts, puppets, treasure spirits, and so on. In terms of numbers, these creatures were many levels lower than zombies and reptiles. These creatures weren't hostile towards the swordsman, and some of them even felt close to him. In fact, it all depended on their master's attitude when he was alive, which was then expressed in their bodies. The journey became more leisurely, and Lu Xiaoyi, on the other hand, was troubled. Because the blood of the food he had brought with him had run out, he had no choice but to control himself and stay in a state of hunger for a long time. Seeing a reptile or a slightly hostile demonic beast made him very happy, because there was food again. It was an awkward situation, but his companions couldn't understand. They continued on like this, and when they entered the third and final open area, he was already in a state of complete hunger. There was nothing else that could hunt for him. Fortunately, he wouldn't starve to death, because the thing that was sealed in the depths of his soul wouldn't allow such a situation to happen. It was just that this feeling was really unbearable. 3 open areas, 3 different ecological circles, and also represented 3 different attitudes towards cultivation. Those that could still maintain self-discipline after losing their master were those that had truly attained the Tao. They didn't stay here to wait for death, but to wait for a big enough change and not to charge forward like idiots. The sword spirit was still in front, and Lu Xiaoyi was behind. Sometimes they would run along the main road, and sometimes they would plunge into the dense network of branch cracks. During this process, Lu Xiaoyi slowly learned how to distinguish between the branches of the network and the passageways. He wasn't too sure if the passageway had started to block again, because he wasn't familiar with the inside and outside of the passageway at all. However, as long as the sword spirit was willing to go, he would just follow. However, he was really a little curious. Where did the sword spirit want to bring him to? As they walked further and further, and as time passed, he began to wonder if the sword spirit wanted to bring him to the entrance of the inner and outer scenery heaven. He was a little nervous, but also a little excited. However, could he go to that place with his current state? Would he be unable to go in? Would he be beaten up if he went in? Was this the right time to go in? The more he walked, the more his heart itched, and he couldn't stop. After entering the passageway for nearly 2 years, a man and a sword came to a straight road. There was a dense light in front of them, making it impossible to look at directly. Lu Xiaoyi felt that the thing that was sealed in the depths of his soul was ready to move, so he knew that he had come to a very important place, the intersection of the 3 passageways of the inner scenery heaven, the outer scenery heaven, and the splendid heaven and earth. If he could pass through that dense light, he might go to a place that he didn't even dare to think about before. The sword spirit began to wander around, as if looking for something. Lu Xiaoyi followed behind, and couldn't help but start to complain out of habit. "Old man, what are you looking for? We can kill the zombies, and I don't care about the reptiles. Even if we have to fight with those treasure spirits, I'll help you. But this is not a place where you can go as you please. It doesn't matter if you fight with a demi-immortal, but my small body can't take it. I'm not a junior, but there should be a limit to crossing realms, right?" The sword spirit did not pay any attention to him at all. Instead, he kept looking for the sword spirit, which gave Lu Xiaoyi a headache. After getting along with the sword spirit for nearly 2 years, he felt closer to this strange sword spirit than he did to Shi Zhao and his other senior brothers. The most important thing was his respect for the senior sword vein. In the path of sword Dao, who could cultivate to the demi-immortal level wasn't an earth-shattering figure. Such a figure was worthy of him following and doing his best. The sword spirit was old and gone, leaving behind this unyielding sword spirit. He should send it on its last journey. However, this didn't mean that he could tolerate other people's arrangements for him. Lu Xiaoyi hated other people's arrangements for his cultivation the most. In the first 2,000 years of cultivation, he had always been making arrangements for himself, and he had also opened up a path that belonged to him alone. Now that he had reached the primordial spirit realm with great difficulty, he was being arranged? What kind of abilities should go to what kind of place? If he went down, he could be arrogant, but if he went up, he could only be beaten. He didn't have a good temper, and he couldn't be submissive. No matter who it was, they couldn't make him yield. It was said that there were at least tens of thousands of demi-immortals in the exterior, heavenly realm. Was this something that he could show off with his current ability? Although he thought so, his body was unusually honest because he was a person who was not stingy and liked novelty. He had been traveling in the main world for hundreds of years, and with his current strength, he felt that all the mountains were small. It seemed that if he went down, he wouldn't be able to improve in essence. Then, was this the beginning of another chapter for him? Chapter 1695. P.S. Looking for guaranteed monthly votes. On the other side of the passage, about 10 miles away from the entrance, for Shi Zhao's swordsmen were lined up in a row, ready for battle. This time, the passage had been open for 2 years, and only now did it show signs of closing. However, there were only 4 left out of the 5 people. Over the past 2 years, Nightmare had requested to enter countless times, but was rejected by Fuji. Now, seeing that the passage was about to close, Nightmare made his last request. Senior, before the passage closes, it's not too late for me to enter. It's not necessarily dangerous for me inside. We've been guarding this place for tens of thousands of years, so we're very clear about the situation inside. At most, we'll waste a few years inside. After we find Junior Liu, we'll wait for the passage to open and then come back. Fuji shouted, "Shut up. Nightmare, you've been cultivating for tens of thousands of years, so why are you still so impatient? Must you push the responsibility to yourself? Sword Vein involves countless people. Can you pull all of them? Junior Liu is not a child, and he's not a Sword Vein newbie. His reputation in the outside world is far beyond our reach. Not to mention his personal strength. Who among us dares to say that we can beat him? This is only in close proximity, with our mortal bodies. If we were to drag him out into the universe, none of us would be his opponent. Do you know that you'll be fine if you enter for a few years? You'll be fine, but Junior Liu won't be? He's far stronger than we think. This small storm can't trap him. On the other hand, all of you want to run inside? What's the meaning of this? Is it just to save someone? Or do you want to go in and play?" The few of them were embarrassed and kept silent. Fuji snorted. "Everyone has their own responsibilities. We swordsmen believe in ourselves, but we also have to believe in our companions. Not to mention a companion who's stronger than you. What are you worried about? That guy is much tougher than you. Think about how long it took for us to get used to eating raw meat and drinking insect blood when we first came here. But to him, it's a natural thing. There's nothing that he doesn't dare to do, and he doesn't have the rules that we sinners of Shi Zhao have. Moreover, the passage now is not like before. There are many forks, and it's densely covered with spider webs. If there aren't many people searching at the same time, do you expect one person to succeed?" He was only afraid that if one of them returned, the other would be lost. There's nothing to discuss, and there's no need to do anything. Just retreat and wait quietly. I'm not worried that junior brother Liu won't come back. I'm just worried about him. His junior brothers were very curious. "Senior brother, what are you worried about?" Fu Qiu sighed. "Junior brother Liu is arrogant and reckless. In just a short 20 years, you can also see that he is a person who dares to cause trouble without the slightest scruple. What could happen in the passageway? One was in the ancient battlefield of zombies. Secondly, it's at the other end of the tunnel." Timu nodded. "That is indeed a possibility. In any case, there was no way he would stay at the blocked crack and wait. If he really wanted to return, all he had to do was find the main road, which was actually a very simple matter. It's been 2 years. I'm afraid he's already on the other side, right?" Entering Nightmare was a little flustered and exasperated. He knew that this fellow didn't have any good ideas. She actually acted alone and didn't even call them along? Are we still brothers? The outside world was very exciting. It was certain that this fellow would not be able to hold himself back here. But he didn't expect it to be in such a way. Wasn't he afraid of the eye of heaven's blame?
There were only 4 people left.
If reinforcements didn't come before the next time the passageway opened, it would be difficult to defend. The sword spirit slowly flew over and circled around Liu Xiaoyi 3 times. In their interactions, this meant that he wanted him to follow him. "Old fellow, you can't harm me. There are still so many senior sisters who haven't had the chance to do so." Liu Xiaoyi was half reluctant and half willing. He appeared to be very resistant, but his body was very honest. 2 years of interaction had made him understand the sword spirit style. He was a little stubborn, a little old-fashioned, had a bad temper, was very controlling, was competitive, and so on. But there was one thing that this old fellow, was very reliable. He had made preparations when he raided the ancient battlefield. Bypassing the reptiles' territory was a judgment of the situation. During the entire 2 years, he acted with a purpose and a plan. He wasn't brainless. On the contrary, he seemed to be very intelligent. It seemed that it was okay to trust such an old sword spirit one more time. He had heard from senior brothers Shi Zhao that they were guarding the side of the passageway, but there was no one guarding the side of the inner and outer scenic sky. This was very normal. What kind of people lived in the inner and outer scenic sky? They were all big tigers. Why would they be afraid of messy things coming in and causing trouble? On the contrary, the ruler of the immortal court was afraid that these people would come in and take the opportunity to slip away from the side of the inner scenic sky. The old sword spirit began to become very different. The sword light shone brightly and circled 3 times in the air. The sword whistled desolately. Although it was not a language, the swordsman could clearly hear the emotions in it. It was arrogant and heroic as well as some lingering and reluctance. Lu Xiaoyi realized something. He raised his eyebrows and shouted, "Old fellow. Don't play this trick on me. You're playing with those dying people who pretend to be pitiful. I won't accept it. I'll get whatever I want.
I don't need anyone to help me.
Even if you're a senior from the sword vein." After shouting, he turned around and left without hesitation. This old fellow was obviously going to use the last of his energy to open the passageway to the 3 realms for him. How could he accept this for nothing? Respect was respect, and ego was ego. How could they be mixed together? At some point he was also a dog, but his legs were short. How fast could a mortal run? The sword spirit caught up from behind and circled around him. This was the intention of binding him. But when a dog turned hostile, he would not recognize anyone. The 7 came out of its sheath and knocked against the sword spirit. It knocked the sword spirit's already weak sword body and knocked it far away. He was still proud of himself. "Old fellow, do you know how powerful I am now? I let you go before, because I was afraid that you would lose face. I'll comfort you when you're old, but it doesn't mean that I'm afraid of you. Not to mention you, a mere sword spirit. Even if your master came personally, he would have to talk to me nicely. Hee, I can even cut down the yang spirit. So, what if you're a half-immortal? You're already so old. Why don't you spend your old age peacefully and have a good ending? If you want to run away, I'll help you, regardless of the gods and Buddhas in the sky. But if you want to kill yourself, you'll put a golden hoop curse on me after you die.
Dream on."
Do you think a person like me can be easily controlled by others? The sword spirit was so angry that his whole body trembled. He didn't expect that after 2 years of hard work, he would finally realize that this thing had such a bad temper. If they were to really fight, he might not be able to beat him. Time was of the essence, and he couldn't delay. If he wanted to subdue this audacious fellow in the lower realm, he had no choice but to. The sword body began to change. It was still in the form of a sword, but 2 large words slowly formed on the sword hilt. A wave of obscure mountain aura rushed over. Lu Xiaoyi was dumbfounded. Chapter 1696. Lu Xiaoyi instantly lost his temper. This was because there were 2 ancient characters on the hilt of the sword spirit's incarnation, 3 Qin. You can't fool me. I've seen Uncle Qin before. On the sword Dao tablet, I also saw the 11 yang spirit slayings you left behind. Lu Xiaoyi was still in a daze when the sword spirit suddenly turned and slashed 2 sword beams at him. They brushed past his cheeks as if they were scraping his face. He knew why he was slashed twice. It was because the 3 Qin had only left behind 9 impressions on the sword Dao tablet, not 11. Therefore, 2 impressions had to be removed. Clearly, the sword spirit had difficulty condensing the word, so it could not do more. However, this was enough. The aura, the name, and the 2 slashes were enough. How could someone who had not experienced the sword Dao tablet and 3 lives realm know such a secret? He did not feel any joy, only sadness. Meeting in such a manner was unbearable for him. He immediately bowed, still not speaking human language. "You're already like this, yet you still come out to scare people." The sword spirit trembled even more violently. If not for its firm sword heart, it would have been scattered by this disdainful disciple. Cunning and crafty, without any respect for his elders, unbridled and unbridled. However, he always did shocking things and did not walk the normal path. He was somewhat similar to a certain person in its memories. He was young, and his cultivation level was not high, but he had already done great things in the universe's cultivation world. Thinking back, it was just like the person it had met in the universe's void 20,000 years ago. The words "have you eaten" were still fresh in its memory. Xianyuan was not alone, and the sword Dao existed forever. Generation after generation of outstanding disciples appeared. It did not need to worry about the sword vein's future after it left. In front of it was Scoundrel Li, and behind it was Hoodlum Lu. The more people like this, the more it felt at ease. It had no regrets. The sword spirit shook and stabbed diagonally. It grabbed Lu Xiaoyi's belt and flew towards the dense fog. Lu Xiaoyi could do nothing about it. Although the three Qins weren't considered ancestors, their status in Xuanyuan's sword vein was no small matter. He had been in charge of Xianyuan for thousands of years. He was the longest among all the ancestors. He was also the one who had achieved great things and was highly regarded by the masses. His era was the most powerful era in the history of Xianyuan. Not only did he successfully complete the role change from Blue Sky to Five Ring, but there were also many amazing people in the sect, such as Wu Shixing, Chong Lu, and Crow Ancestor. They were recognized as the most powerful generation in Xianyuan Sword School. As the host, the three Qins played an important role. The sky waxes and wanes, the moon waxes and wanes. People are divided into submissive and submissive, sects rise and fall. No one, or any force, could remain strong forever. There would always be a time when the tide would rise and fall. The true leaders would always enter the fast lane of strength before the arrival of a great change. Perhaps there would be a surge of talents, or perhaps there would be a sudden emergence of a new force. This was the trend of the times. Lu Xiaoyi couldn't insist on doing things his own way with such an ancestor. Moreover, in Xuanyuan's evaluation, the three Qins had always been known for their foresight and foresight. Although it wasn't in person now, it was a sword spirit that had followed him for tens of thousands of years. Even if it was a piece of rotten wood, it should be able to grind out some spirituality, right? It must have a purpose. It must have something that it felt it had to do. That was why it forcefully brought him to the intersection of the three realms. This definitely had nothing to do with the personal grudges of the three Qins. This was the usual style of this ancestor. An existence of his realm would not force his disciples to walk the path he chose. Not to mention a primordial soul-perfected cultivator. Even the Yuanying perfected cultivator Xianyuan wouldn't set a cultivation path for someone. That could only be related to one thing, Xianyuan. After thinking through this point, Lu Xiaoyi no longer had any misgivings. It was his duty to contribute to the sect. The sword was shining brightly. That was the sword spirit's unrestrained energy overdraft. Obviously, the sword spirit was no longer thinking about its future. This was also in line with the style of a swordsman. It was far better to leave freely than to struggle at death's door. There were still many questions, but now is not the time to ask. Among them, the most important one was the heaven of interior and heaven of exterior. Where would the sword spirit send him? According to the sect's records, the ancestors of the three Qins walked the path of the declined state. Therefore, the chances of them going to the exterior realms were very high. In any case, the three Qins had stayed there for 10 or 20,000 years. They must have a lot of connections. The sword spirit was no longer shining brightly. It was basically burning itself. The decline of a generation of sword immortals was happening in front of him. It was a pity. It was different from the splendid heaven and earth in the mortal world. The mortal world was guarded by manpower. Here, There was a layer of dense fog that belonged to the power of cultivation. Lu Xiaoyi's mortal body could do nothing about it, but the sword's spirit obviously had its own way. As the sword shone brightly and broke through the layer of dense fog, Lu Xiaoyi was pushed into it. Immediately, he felt the seal in the depths of his soul loosen. The deeper it went, the more it loosened. The sword spirit's aura became weaker and weaker, but its brilliance became stronger and stronger. Lu Xiaoyi felt his power gradually returning to his body. When he regained it after losing it for several decades, it was even more precious. Finally, the sword spirit's remaining power could not push it any further. It stopped at the last layer of dense fog. The sword spirit let out a shrill cry, as if it was provoking the injustice of heaven. You really don't care about your body. If it was someone else, both of us would be stuck in there like specimens. Qi and swung out, and the majestic power pierced through the last thin layer of dense fog. Lu Xiaoyi felt that he was suspended in a void. Luckily, he had completely broken free from the seal. Otherwise, who knew where he would fall? At the same time, he felt the sword spirit's last remnant shadow plunging into Qi and disappearing. The three Qins, along with the last thought he had left in this world, had completely become history. There was no time to be sentimental. Lu Xiaoyi had to determine his direction in the shortest time possible. Behind him was the layer of dense fog. He couldn't go back. In front of him, he could feel that there were two different paths. Although he didn't know where they led, he knew which path was closed to him and which was open. On the right path, there was a faint force pushing him back. He squeezed a few more steps forward and found that the pushing force was getting stronger. He knew that this path was blocked. In fact, in this place that was a few levels higher than him, there was no room for him to choose. He could only walk to the left because there was no force pushing him back. Mount Hua was a path. The sword spirit didn't provide any help to his choice. Perhaps he had also expected this. But what made him feel a little confused was that if the three Qins had given him a mission, what kind of mission was it? How could he guess in such an unclear way? The road ahead was not far, especially now that he had completely recovered his full strength. It would only take a few breaths of time. There was a mysterious force stirring around his body. He could guess that this might be the force that isolated the inner and outer realm from each other, but it had no effect on him. He was a little confused when he took a step forward. There were celestial mountains in front of him, surrounded by auspicious clouds. Spiritual vigor seemed to be substantial. An ancient and boundless feeling came over him. He had also heard people talk about the exterior realm. It didn't seem like this. Could it be that he had come to the interior realm? The three Qins definitely hadn't come here before. Had he come to the wrong place? Chapter 1697. Lu Xiaoyi was a little confused. This wasn't the exterior heaven he had imagined, so it could only be the interior heaven. Thinking about it carefully, it seemed to make sense. The exterior heaven only accepted cultivators in the decline state. Lu Xiaoyi's cultivation level wasn't high enough, so it was impossible for him to enter the decline state. So, it was normal for him to be rejected? He had always wondered if he should go through the back door of the three Qin dynasties, but now it seemed that the patriarch didn't mean to do so. The interior heaven advocated ancient methods to become immortal, such as severing three corpses. Lu Xiaoyi certainly didn't follow the path of severing three corpses, but his method of integrating the big and small universes seemed to be an ancient method. As for the low cultivation level, he didn't know if he had to sever a corpse to enter. Now it seemed that he didn't need to do so. As a newcomer, he had to tuck his tail between his legs. Lu Xiaoyi kept reminding himself that this wasn't the main world, but a place where half-immortals gathered. He couldn't be cocky and would lose his life. From the bottom of his heart, he really didn't want to come to this place. He had a strong vital spirit and could act like a big shot in the main world's cultivation world. He had only been in the limelight for a few days, and the sword in his hand hadn't shown off its brilliance. Now he was forced to stay in the half-celestial realm and continue to be a coward. As a newcomer to the celestial realm, he didn't feel nervous, but he had to be more careful. Obviously, the countless celestial mountains in the distance couldn't be ownerless. If he rashly entered, he could only bet on his luck and see if he met someone who was easy to talk to, or someone who was prejudiced against the sword vein. Therefore, the best way was to not act rashly and just quietly observe and appreciate, because in his heart, this wasn't a place he was qualified to stay. This world was like a huge painting of mountains and rivers. The heavenly way splashed ink on it, and all the scenic spots and historical sites in the universe were included in it, forming a three-dimensional ancient scenery. It was like a huge universe, but instead of celestial phenomena, there were mountains and rivers, vast seas and vast sands, swamps and forests. Many of these places were places where sages of the past had become saints. This kind of mighty power was no longer something a celestial sage could do. Except for the natural formation of the universe's will, no one else could create such a space. As soon as Lu Xiaoyi entered the interior sky, he immediately understood why this place was a paradise for ancient techniques. Because this was a completely ancient environment, the order of the heavenly Tao had not been completely established. It was still growing, forming, colliding, and devouring in the chaos. Such an environment could not form a stable path to the upper realm. That kind of grinding technique that relied on entering the declining realm to grind time would not work here at all, because the environment of the Great Tao was always changing. But unconsciously, it was very compatible with his method of fusing the great and small universes. Thus, he understood that the method he had created was actually an ancient method. However, it was an ancient method that had been lost long ago. It was an ancient method that required the right time, the right place, and the right people. It was an ancient method that was born at the right time and destroyed at the wrong time. If he could seize the opportunity when the epoch changed, he would be able to reach the heavens in a single bound. If he couldn't, then this was a failed ancient method. Looking into the distance, he vaguely discovered that there were still ordinary people living here. It was not completely exclusive to the demi-immortals. Thus, he restrained his breath and flew at a low altitude, not daring to be too conspicuous. Not long after, he arrived at a human village. He did not enter, but observed beside an ancient pine on a hill outside the village. Thus, he gained some understanding of the place. This place was still thousands of miles away from the nearest mountain. It was very majestic. It stood in the clouds, and its top and bottom were unknown. It stretched for thousands of miles, and there were countless strange peaks. It was unknown which famous mountain in the universe had been materialized here by the will of the heavenly Tao. The spiritual vigor in the interior sky was incomparable to any of the realms in the main world. Not only was it as thick as liquid, but it was also wild and uncontrollable. In such a place, what kind of human could safely embark on the path of Taoism? After carefully observing these villagers, Lin Fan found the answer. The mortals here and the mortals in the origin world were two different concepts. Although they did not practice any martial arts, their bodies seemed to be born with some kind of martial arts. Even so, their superior physical conditions did not help them too much, because they also faced troubles that the mortals in the origin world did not encounter. For example, unpredictable natural disasters and rampaging demonic beasts. These were probably the real living conditions of the ancient humans, right? He was still figuring out everything about the interior sky. This could only be left to time and could not be rushed. After looking at the environment, it was time to turn around and look at himself. This time, after the seal was lifted, it was not done by the same person. Or, rather, it was not done in the same environment. When he entered, he was sealed by the rules of the splendid heaven and earth. When he came out, he was freed by the mighty force of the interior sky. He needed to examine carefully to see if there was any difference. He was a cautious person, always paying attention to his own state. Only when he fought with all his might could he not have any worries. One by one, he thoroughly checked his whole body. There was nothing strange, and no one had done anything to his body. This was expected, and it was not surprising, except for one thing: his chi ant. He put his divine sense in the sparrow palace. The chi ant swam slowly. It looked normal, but there was a faint breath emitting from it, and it did not hide it. It seemed to have an additional temperament: live to the fullest, die without regrets. This was what the sword spirit of the three Qin had left for him. He slowly surrounded it with his divine sense. He knew that this was the real message that the sword spirit had left for him, and he needed to study it slowly. Although he had never really met this ancestor, Lu Xiaoyi believed that they were fated to meet. In the sword Tao steel, there was also this final farewell. This was the inheritance. What the sword spirit wanted to tell him was actually very simple. There was no cultivation method or swordsmanship. These things were basically meaningless to a primordial spirit. What the three Qin were good at might not necessarily be what Lu Xiaoyi liked. At their level, they all walked their own path, and there was no one to teach them. It was just pointing him to meet a person who was incomparably important to Xian Yuan. One was a mountain scenery with a hanging wall eagle nest. It did not take up much space, but it was extremely high. The cliff was covered with large and small eagle nests, and the person the sword spirit wanted him to find was probably among them. The other picture was a person handsome and elegant. Lu Xiaoyi had seen a portrait of this person in the ancestral hall at the dome, and he was not unfamiliar with it. So, he was actually walking the path of ancient cultivation? There was no specific mission. It was just one place and one person. He could not figure out which ancestor was cultivating in this hanging wall eagle nest. Or were there two people? It should be this person who was cultivating on the eagle cliff. His divine sense continued to go deeper, but the sword spirit of the three Qin had no other instructions. It only left a gray ball at the core of the sword spirit. Lu Xiaoyi probed it and immediately knew what it was. It was the true meaning of the great Tao of reincarnation left behind by the corpse lotus. In order to wrap up this ball of true meaning of the great Tao, the sword spirit had wasted a huge amount of energy just to give the younger generation a chance to take a look at the great Tao. From beginning to end, the sword spirit of the three Qin did not say any nonsense, but it also seemed to have said countless words, vividly displaying the strength of an old swordsman who was serious in speech and manner and whose sword heart was like iron. The ancestors' intentions must be accepted. Accepting it was equivalent to accepting Xuanyuan's blow. Lu Xiaoyi was willing. Under the pine tree, Lu Xiaoyi's face was still like water. He could not let down the three Qin's good intentions, and he could no longer avoid his responsibility to Xian Yuan. Fate comes to me under the pine tree. I sleep on a high pillow. There is no calendar in the mountains, and the cold does not know the year. Chapter 1698. What Lu Xiaoyi didn't expect was that the first thing he did after entering interior heaven was to raise his reincarnation Tao from beginner level to a basic level. The rest still needed time to polish, and wasn't something that could be done overnight. When he woke up from the enlightenment of reincarnation, he didn't know how much time had passed. Anyway, a carefree girl in the village was now married. Time really didn't mean much here. What was a few thousand years worth of lifespan? The village was a self-sufficient place. Over the years, very few outsiders came near, and very few villagers went out. They were still living a family lifestyle with very little social cooperation, self-farming, and plenty of food and clothing. They did not have as many tools as the people who came after them, and they did not have a rich and colorful entertainment life. The most common way of communication was probably the most primitive market, which was still in a rudimentary mode of fighting against the heavens and the earth. He didn't want to disturb the lives of these mortals. Cultivators still had to find other cultivators. As the saying goes, birds of a feather flock together. First, he had to find someone he could communicate with. If he got rid of Buddhism, he might have to get rid of Orthodox Taoism. This made him very embarrassed. The sword veins' attitude towards cultivation really made it difficult for them to have the kind of connections that were all over the world and close neighbors in the universe. They were probably a little better than insects, but there was a limit to how good they could be. He stood up and laughed at himself. What's wrong with me? Did I really become a chicken after coming to a new place? The breath left by the sword spirits of the three chain swords was to live happily and die without regrets. How long has it been? And I've forgotten it all. He had to admit that in terms of open-mindedness and living a carefree life, he was still far from these older swordsmen. If that's the case, why think so much? Let's start from the nearest celestial mountain. Who cares who it is? If we can talk, we'll talk. If we can't talk, we'll fight. What's the big deal? Once he made up his mind, he felt relaxed. How much does cultivation have to do with realms? Since he came to the celestial mountain, he was the fated one. This was the correct concept of cultivation. In a world of ignorance, there would only be surprises if he continued walking. Not long after, he was already floating on top of the celestial mountain. He looked down and saw the scenery of the celestial mountain. There were no traces of man-made chiseling. Everything was natural. The mountain was called Hidden Dragon Mountain because there was a cave on the mountainside. The cave was called Hidden Dragon Cave, and there was a poem engraved on it. The dragon returns to the primordial sea. The yang hides in the yin. People say the dragon hides, but I hides in the heart. Silence hides its use. Breaths are deep. The white clouds lie high. The world has no bosom friend. Lu Xiaoyi silently observed the terrain of the mountain, and then looked into the depth of the cave. He paced back and forth for a while, and then left in disappointment. This was a good place, but there was no one to set up a base here. What he wanted now was to find someone, not a cave for cultivation. Before he left, he wrote a poem on a blue stone outside the cave, thinking that he had come here. At the silent hibernation dragon gate, seeking the truth does not meet the truth. Only the crane on the pine is the person in the cave. The fragrance of the flowers in the herb garden is different. The deer in the sand spring is new. Just as he stepped onto the cloud, a voice sounded out. Since you're already here, you should take things as they come. Fellow Taoist, are you blaming my master for being indifferent and lacking in manners for leaving in such a hurry? Lu Xiaoyi clasped his hands in the cloud. I'm a newcomer who doesn't know the rules. I accidentally entered a new world, and I'm in fear and trepidation, seeking the truth.
The voice laughed.
Seeking the truth, you've come to the wrong place. It's just a simple person in the mountain who hasn't cared about the world for a long time. An old Taoist floated out of the hibernation dragon cave. He had the demeanor of an immortal and raised his hand to invite him. Lu Xiaoyi leaped down and gladly accepted the invitation. He had a new understanding of this place called Interior Sky. Just now, he didn't fully open his divine sense, nor did he explore the bottom of the cave. This had nothing to do with his ability. It was just a form of politeness. Just like a visitor in the mortal world, when the master is not home, you can't just lean against the window and look carefully, can you? Or jump over the wall to find out what's going on. Being carefree is carefree, and being polite is being polite. Only by keeping to one's duty would there be all kinds of things after that. This was the basic cultivation of a cultivator. But he also had to admit that a half-immortal was a half-immortal. This breath was restrained as if it was light, and there wasn't a trace of smoke or fire. Even if Lu Xiaoyi didn't use his full strength, his perception was still very good. He couldn't smell any trace of human breath, which showed the level of the cultivators here. Outside the cave, ancient pine trees were connected. The two of them sat on top of a pine tree and chatted. The old Taoist glanced at Lu Xiaoyi. It's rare to have such achievements at such a young age. I'm Lu Jiang and I'm living here. Little friend, you're new here. Don't think that I'm some hibernation dragon immortal, a turtledove occupying a magpie's nest. I'm just borrowing it for shelter. Lu Xiaoyi was very polite. It's a drop in the ocean, not worth mentioning. It's a coincidence. I'm still wondering how I can come to a place like this with my current state. I want to leave, but I also want to see. It's very contradictory. I'm cigarette butt, and I'm happy to meet such a virtuous person. If there's any noise, please forgive me. Lu Jiang sneered. Since you can come in, you're qualified. Why should I care about your state? Little friend, you're in the primordial spirit realm. In the history of the interior heaven, almost half of the yang spirits and yin spirits have come in. As long as you don't follow the old path and don't walk the path of decline, the heavenly axiom recognizes you, and you're qualified. Lu Xiaoyi blushed with shame. The main thing is that the heavenly axiom is flawed, so the gap is a little bigger. If we push back for tens of thousands of years, the primordial spirit might not be able to enter. If we push back for tens of thousands of years, the yang spirit might not be able to enter. Lu Jiang smiled. What do you do before pushing? You just have to stand there. Now that you can come in, it's a form of recognition. As for the heavenly axiom being flawed, when has the heavenly axiom not been flawed? Lu Xiaoyi said seriously, May I ask, Senior, what do I have to pay attention to when I'm new here? What do I have to understand? What do I have to do? Lu Jiang also said seriously, Do as you wish. Where are the rules? Our generation's ancient methods should follow our hearts. Don't tell me that you're no longer you when you come here. For example, if you see that my place is not bad and want to take it, why can't you? You leaving a poem is a kind of fate. The two of us have done it once, so it's another kind of fate. There's not much difference between the two. Me asking you to stay for a chat today doesn't mean anything. On another day, in a different environment, maybe I'll take your head. There are no rules. Do you understand what I'm saying? Lu Xiaoyi smiled. Senior, you're straightforward. That's the style of ancient cultivation. I've learned a lot. It's a pure coincidence that I came to interior heaven. Since I'm here, I have to experience it to be worthy of this opportunity. But after experiencing it, I still have to leave. If I just want to travel, has Senior taught me anything? Lu Jiang shook his head. You still don't understand. There's no such thing as traveling here. Once you're here, you're a person of interior heaven. You have to accept everything here, whether it's good or bad. Those who cultivate the ancient methods mostly act freely and rarely hide. This is the temperament of interior heaven. But if you want to ask about the general environment of interior heaven, I'm in a good mood today, so I don't mind saying a few words. The heart is Tao, and Tao is the heart. There's no Tao outside the heart, and there's no heart outside the Tao. Since you're here, don't think too much. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.